Ea, Cthulhu Fatagan. 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 Hi, my name is Greywaste Tim. This is my first stream on my own. So I'm just going to turn on a light. And I think that's a bit too bright. Wow, that looks terrible. What wouldn't be a first stream without terrible technical difficulties, right? Okay, that looks better. All right, so this is hey Damon, joining me as always, Prince Damon of the Grey Keep. Hey boy, we're gonna read some stories. Yes, tonight we're reading some Lovecraft, some Bierce, and some Chambers. I'm going live tomorrow with David Lightbringer for Starry Night Wisdom Sundays. We're going to be talking further east, Five Forts. There's a lot of Lovecraft out there. I joke that the further east, it's all Lovecraft in Russia out there. We have Kadath, Carcosa, places like Leng, a lot of Lovecraftian Easter eggs. Ib's not out in the further east, but these are places that pop up in Lovecraft. And me being the teenage goth kid that I was like, when I first started reading A Song of Ice and Fire, when I picked up the world of Ice and Fire and looked at these maps, I was like, hey, these sound familiar. I wonder. And then lo and behold, I find like, oh, okay, George is a Lovecraft fan, and he's not, and with his further east, not just incorporating Lovecraftian elements, he's straight up taking things from Lovecraft and incorporating them in the story. Well, they're more than likely not going to be in the story, but what George does, and he's a master at this, is he gives us just a tiny little nugget of information. Like, these are places we maybe only get one or two sentences on, but if you take the information in those sentences and then you divert them back to their original source material, you can kind of glean a sense of what George is trying to do and what he's drawing reference to, but also things that he wants us to think about that are going on in the story prominently in Westeros and also in the western half of Essos, where Danny currently is. But in celebration of that, since Lovecraft and his contemporaries have all been dead for over 70 years, their works are in the public domain. So I just wanted to read some stories. Yes, we do have a cat. We have a black cat. I joked again, Twitter, follow me on Twitter at the Grey Waste. I joked that I am well aware as a white man with a black cat reading Lovecraft how the optics of this are going to look. But Damon's a good boy. Damon is a very, very good boy, and he doesn't need that. He doesn't need that. But we're going to start off with Ambrose Bierce and then with his An Inhabitant of Carcosa, and then I also have Robert W. Chambers, The King in Yellow. I want to read two stories from that. We're going to do In the Court of the Dragon and The Yellow Sign, and then we're going to dive into some Lovecraft. And these are things that I'm going to be talking about a lot with Dave tomorrow. Dave got about 20 pages of notes from me from two separate documents. One's from an abandoned theory of mine I couldn't quite make work, but the research that went into it has some good nuggets of information, especially in regards to House Dane, House Stark. I am a big into the idea that the first men did not all come as one, that they came in waves and that they came from all different parts of Essos, not just over the Armadorn. I believe that there are Eastern first men, which would be kind of refugees from the great empire of the Dawn after the fall of the empire. We kind of see that in House Dane. House Dane has a lot of evidence that House Dane is originally from the great empire rather than from let's say the area that would now be the Free Cities, where other first men may have come from. That's all discussion for tomorrow with Dave. We're going to get into that. For now, we're going to go straight into some stories. I'm going to put my headphones on just to be good. Make absolutely sure. Let's maybe set some ambiance here. I have dark piano and the sounds of rain. Just going to lower the volume on those. I don't want them to overpower the stream. All right, this is how I first did At the Mountains of Madness when I was a kid. I set up just a thing like this. I put on an audiobook version of it, played some Sounds of Rain, and I sat in my room. I had yes, Hale's Satin and A Song of Ice and Fire is someone that deserves some praise. So yeah, Hail Satin. Yeah, so we're going to start with Ambrose Bierce's An Inhabitant of Carcosa. For there be divers sorts of death, somewhere in the body remaineth, and in some it vanisheth quite away with the spirit. This commonly occurreth only in solitude, such is God's will. And none seeing the end, we say the man is lost or gone on a long journey, which indeed he hath, but sometimes it hath happened in sight of many, as abundant testimony showeth. In one kind of death the spirit also dieth, and this it hath been known to do while yet the body was in vigor for many years. Sometimes, as is veritably attested, it dieth with the body, but after a season is raised up again in that place where the body did decay. Pondering these words of Hali, whom God rest, and questioning their full meaning, as one who, having an intimation, yet doubts if there be not something behind, other than that which he has discerned. I noted not whither I had strayed, until a sudden chill wind striking my face revived in me a sense of my surroundings. I observed with astonishment that everything seemed unfamiliar. On every side of me stretched a bleak and desolate expanse of plain, covered with a tall overgrowth of sere grass, which rustled and whistled in the autumn wind with heaven knows what mysterious and disquieting suggestion. Protruded at long intervals above it stood strangely shaped and somber-colored rocks, which seemed to have an understanding with one another and to exchange looks of uncomfortable significance, as if they had reared their heads to watch the issue of some foreseen event. A few blasted trees here and there appeared as leaders in this malevolent conspiracy of silent expectation. The day, I thought, must be far advanced, though the sun was invisible. And although sensible that the air was raw and chill, my consciousness of that fact was rather mental than physical. I had no feeling of discomfort. Over all the dismal landscape, a canopy of low, lead-colored clouds hung like a visible curse. In all this there was a menace and a portent, a hint of evil, an intimation of doom. Bird, beast, or insect there was none. The wind sighed in the bare branches of the dead trees, and the gray grass bent to whisper its dread secret to the earth. But no other sound nor motion broke the awful repose of that dismal place. I observed in the herbage a number of weather-worn stones, evidently shaped with tools. They were broken, covered with moss, and half sunken in the earth. Some lay prostrate, some leaned at various angles. None was vertical. They were obviously headstones of graves, though the graves themselves no longer existed, as either mounds or depressions. The years had leveled all. Scattered here and there, more massive blocks showed where some pompous tomb or ambitious monument had once flung its feeble defiance at oblivion. So old seemed these relics, these vestiges of vanity and memorials of affection and piety, so battered and worn and stained, so neglected, deserted, forgotten the place, that I could not help thinking myself the discoverer of the burial ground of a prehistoric race of men whose very name was long extinct. Filled with these reflections, I was for some time heedless of the sequence of my own experiences, but soon I thought, how came I hither? A moment's reflection seemed to make this all clear and explain at the same time, though in a disquieting way, the singular character with which my fancy had invested all that I saw or heard. I was ill. I remembered now that I had been prostrated by a southern fever, and that my family had told me that in my periods of delirium, I had constantly cried out for liberty and air, and had been held in bed to prevent my escape out of doors. Now I had eluded the vigilance of my attendants and had wandered hither. To where? I could not conjecture. Clearly, I was at a considerable distance from the city where I dwelt, the ancient and famous city of Carcosa. No signs of human life were anywhere visible nor audible. No rising smoke, no watchdog's bark, no lowing of cattle, no shouts of children at play. Nothing but that dismal burial place with its air of mystery and dread, due to my own disordered brain. Was I not becoming again delirious, there beyond human aid? Was it not indeed all an illusion of my madness? I called aloud the names of my wives and sons, reached out my hands in search of theirs, even as I walked among the crumbling stones and in the withered grass. A noise behind me caused me to turn about. A wild animal, a lynx, was approaching. The thought came to me, if I break down here in the desert, if the fever return and I fail, this beast will be at my throat. I sprang toward it, shouting. It trotted tranquilly by within a hand's breadth of me and disappeared behind a rock. A moment later, a man's head appeared to rise out of the ground a short distance away. He was ascending the farther slope of a low hill, whose crest was hardly to be distinguished from the general level. His whole figure soon came into view against the background of gray cloud. He was half naked, half clad in skins. His hair was unkempt, his beard long and ragged. In one hand he carried a bow and arrow, the other held a blazing torch with a long trail of black smoke. He walked slowly and with caution, as if he feared falling into some open grave concealed by the tall grass. This strange apparition surprised but did not alarm, and taking such a course as to intercept him, I met him almost face to face, accosting him with the familiar salutation, "God keep you." He gave no heed, nor did he arrest his pace. "Good stranger," I continued, "I am ill and lost. Direct me, I beseech you, to Carcosa." The man broke into a barbarous chant in an unknown tongue, passing on and away. An owl on the branch of a decayed tree hooted dismally and was answered by another in the distance. Looking upward, I saw through a sudden rift in the clouds Aldebaran and the Hyades. And all this there was a hint of night, the lynx, the man with the torch, the owl. Yet I saw even the stars in the absence of the darkness. I saw, but was apparently not seen nor heard. Under what awful spell did I exist? I seated myself at the root of a great tree, seriously to consider what it were best to do. That I was mad I could no longer doubt, yet recognized a ground of doubt in the conviction. Of fever I had no trace. I had, withal, a sense of exhilaration and vigor, altogether unknown to me. A feeling of mental and physical exaltation. My senses seemed all alert. I could feel the air as a ponderous substance. I could hear the silence. A great root of the giant tree against whose trunk I leaned, as I sat, held enclosed in its grasp a slab of stone, a part of which protruded into a recess formed by another root. The stone was thus partly protected from the weather, though greatly decomposed. Its edges were worn round, its corners eaten away, its surface deeply furrowed and scaled. Glittering particles of mica were visible in the earth about it, vestiges of its decomposition. This stone had apparently marked the grave out of which the tree had sprung ages ago. The tree's exacting roots had robbed the grave and made the stone a prisoner. A sudden wind pushed some dry leaves and twigs from the uppermost face of the stone. I saw the low relief letters of an inscription and bent to read it. God in heaven, my name in full, the date of my birth, the date of my death. A level shaft of light illuminated the whole side of the tree as I sprang to my feet in terror. The sun was rising in the rosy east. I stood between the tree and his broad red disk. No shadow darkened the trunk. A chorus of howling wolves saluted the dawn. I saw them sitting on their haunches, singly and in groups, on the summits of irregular mounds, and tumuli filling a half of my desert prospect and extending to the horizon. And then I knew that these were ruins of the ancient and famous city of Carcosa. Such are the facts imparted to the medium Beryls by the spirit Hoseid Alar Robarden. So that was An Inhabitant of Carcosa, a short story by Ambrose Bierce. And I'm going to pause the music and the rain. Just going to lay some context about that. Okay, so in Song of Ice and Fire, George does have the ancient city of Carcosa out in the further east. And he has set up a sorcerer lord who claims to be the 69th Yellow Emperor of the Golden Empire of ET. Carcosa first appears in Inhabitant of Carcosa for Ambrose Bierce, and then is later adapted by other writers. Robert W. Chambers will take Carcosa and incorporate that as a setting in The King in Yellow. It's also where we hear the word Hastur. In The King in Yellow, in the short stories that make up The King in Yellow, Hastur is a place, but Hastur would later be incorporated into the Lovecraft mythos. Howard Lovecraft was a huge fan of Chambers. He was greatly enamored with The King in Yellow. He has at times incorporated his own version that is in A Dream of Unknown Kadath. There is the priest that shall not be named, but he wears yellow robes and a yellow silken mask. So it's bringing up the idea of The King in Yellow. And George, in his part, by having this sorcerer lord claim to be a yellow emperor, he's setting up. And again, these are just a few sentences that George has set up in the expanded lore in the very, very back pages of the Worlds of Ice and Fire. But you take this, a sorcerer lord in the city of Carcosa claiming to be Yellow Emperor. It's essentially The King in Yellow. And so that's why we're going to move to The King in Yellow, and who does appear as a character in some of these short stories. And that's why I'm going to start with In the Court of the Dragon. Is that a shy imagine? Yes, Carcosa is out. It's further east of the Shadowlands. It goes past the Shadowlands. Like, there is a Shy's way, way, way out east. It's a port city that sits right at the tip of the Shadowlands. But the world extends further outward past the mountains of the Morn. We have cities like Carcosa, the nation of Mossavi, and the Grey Waste, where I take my name. I'm Grey Waste Tim. Grey Waste is a freezing desert. These are a lot of these things I'm gonna talk with Dave. I didn't focus too much on a Shy. There's so many videos. I mean, I love a Shy, but there's so many videos about it. And Dave go to Dave's channel, check out, he actually put up like a greeter video where he lays out all of the playlists. So you can look at like his Shy and Great Empire, the Dawn videos. And I owe a lot to Dave. Like he's yeah, you're Grey Way Sherpa, but no. Like I said, when I first picked up this, the World of Ice and Fire, and I noticed these, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I want to get more information. And when I really started diving deep into this Great Empire lore, it was Dave. Lucifer means Lightbringer. Now David Lightbringer. I was like, oh, okay. And that's when I was like, I need to start looking into this for myself. And then I did a reread of the main. I had already read the main series. I'd started with the show, read the books while waiting on seasons. And then when COVID hit and I was stuck in quarantine, I actually had COVID. So I spent 2 weeks in my room and I ordered some books, one of which was The World of Ice and Fire. And that was when I actually got my copy of The King in Yellow, and I just devoured it. And that's when I started like really coming to the live streams. And and participating in the chat and then formulating my own ideas. And then eventually, hey, sometimes I'd have a good one and someone would notice it. And they're like, hey, that's a good point. And then it got to the point where now I'm doing a video. Dave's had me on. This will be my third time on. I also have an upcoming episode of Obsidian Knights podcast with the wonderful Gray Area. We did Tyrion 1 and A Clash of Kings. I also have, I'm booked. It's not going to be till late summer, but I have John 6 in A Clash of Kings, which is the Bael the Bard chapter, and I am going to go off on that one. I have so many things to say about Bael the Bard. But yeah, so we're going to move on from Bierce to Chambers, and we're going to start with In the Court of the Dragon. So let's get the music and the rain sounds going again. It's going to lower the volume on the... That sounds like it's at a good level. Okay. All right, so this is In the Court of the Dragon. It's one of the short stories that makes up Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow. The King in Yellow actually is a made-up play that we get snippets of it, but the idea is that you're not hearing music or rain, actually. That's fine. We're having a good time. We don't need it. I guess it was more for me than anything. But okay, so The King in Yellow is the idea is that The King in Yellow is a play, and that to actually read The King in Yellow, to read the play in full would cause absolute madness. And so it's kind of hard to think of an actual production of this play going on. There have been efforts by modern day authors who, because the Cthulhu mythos is it's like a living text. You have authors that still contributing their own stories to it. It's an ever-growing, ever-expanding thing. And there are writers who have gone back to Lovecraft's contemporaries and they've dug up Chambers' works. And there are people that have tried to adapt like an actual proper play to The King in Yellow. Not sure how. I mean, obviously, you can't make a play where it's going to go mad. How would you have actors that do that? How would anyone read the script? But the idea is that to read that The King in Yellow is a forbidden text because reading it will cause madness. And you're also left with the sense that reading it might actually summon this apparition that is the actual King in Yellow, who can exist in an otherworldly plane, but to read the play would mean to summon him to Earth and allow him to cause chaos. So we're going to jump into In the Court of the Dragon by Robert W. Chambers. O thou who burn'st in heart for those who burn, in hell whose fires thyself shall feed and turn, how long be crying, mercy on them, God, why, who art thou to teach and he to learn? In the church of St. Barnaby vespers were over, the clergy left the altar, and little choir boys flocked across the chancel and settled into the stalls. A Swiss in rich uniform marched down the south aisle, sounding his staff at every fourth step on the stone pavement. Behind him came that eloquent preacher and good man, Monsignor C. My chair was near the chancel rail. I now turned toward the west end of the church. The other people between the altar and the pulpit turned too. There was little scraping and rustling while the congregation seated itself again. The preacher mounted the pulpit stairs, and the organ voluntary ceased. I had always found the organ playing at St. Barnaby highly interesting. Learned and scientific it was, too much so for my small knowledge, but expressing a vivid if cold intelligence. Moreover, it possessed the French quality of taste. Taste reigned supreme, self-controlled, dignified, and reticent. Today, however, from the first chord, I had felt a change for the worst, a sinister change. During Vespers, it had been chiefly the chancel organ which supported the beautiful choir, but now and again, quite wantonly, as it seemed, from the west gallery where the great organ stands, something more than harsh and dissonant, and it betrayed no lack of skill. As it recurred again and again, it set me thinking of what my architect's books say about the custom in earthly times, to consecrate the choir as soon as it was built, and that the nave, being finished sometimes half a century later, often did not get any blessing at all. I wondered idly if that had been the case at St. Barnaby, and whether something not usually supposed to be at home in a Christian church might have entered undetected and taken possession of the West Gallery. I had read of such things happening too, but not in works on architecture. Then I remembered that St. Barnaby was not much more than 100 years old, and smiled at the incongruous association of medieval superstitions with that cheerful little piece of 18th century Carcosa. I was going to say, I'm not a professional reader, and pronunciations may vary, especially when we're looking at some early 19th century, early 20th century words, especially when we get into Lovecraft. Your pronunciations may vary, especially when we're talking about the elder things and the outer gods and stuff like that. Cthulhu, however you want to say it, it varies from person to person. But now Vespers were over, and there should have followed a few quiet chords, fit to the company meditation, with which, while we waited for the sermon, instead of that, the discord at the lower end of the church broke out with the departure of the clergy, as if now nothing could control it. I belong to those children of an older and simpler generation who do not love to seek for psychological subtleties in art, and I have ever refused to find in music anything more than melody and harmony. But I felt that in the labyrinth of sounds now issuing from that instrument there was something being hunted. Up and down the pedals chased him, while the manuals blared approval. Poor devil, whoever he was, there seemed small hope of escape. My nervous annoyance changed to anger. Who was doing this? How dare he play like that in the midst of the divine service? I glanced at the people near me. Not one appeared to be in the least disturbed. The placid brows of the kneeling nuns still turned towards the altar, lost none of their devout abstraction under the pale shadow of their white headdress. The fashionable lady beside me was looking expectantly at Monseigneur C. For all her face betrayed, the organ might have been singing an Ave Maria. But now at last the preacher had made the sign of the cross and commanded silence. I turned to him gladly. Thus far I had not found the rest I had counted on when I entered St. Barnaby that afternoon. I was worn out by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble. The last had been the worst, and it was an exhausted body and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive, which I had brought to my favorite church for healing, for I had been reading The King in Yellow. Dumb bastard. The sun ariseth. They gather themselves together and lay them down in their dens. Monseigneur C. delivered his text in a calm voice, glancing quietly over the congregation. My eyes turned, I knew not why, toward the lower end of the church. The organist was coming from behind his pipes and passing along the gallery on his way out. I saw him disappear by a small door that leads some stairs which descend directly to the street. He was a slender man, and his face was as white as his coat was black. Good riddance, I thought, with your wicked music. I hope your assistant will play the closing voluntary. With a feeling of relief, with a deep, calm feeling of relief, I turned back to the mild face in the pulpit and settled myself to listen. Here at last was the ease of mind I longed for. My children, said the preacher, one truth the human soul finds hardest of all to learn, that it has nothing to fear. It can never be made to see that nothing can really harm it. Curious doctrine, I thought, for a Catholic priest. Let us see how he will reconcile that now with the fathers. Nothing can really harm the soul, he went on in his coolest, clearest tones, because... But I never heard the rest. My eye left his face, I knew not for what reason, and sought the lower end of the church. The same man was coming out from behind the organ and was passing along the gallery the same way. But there had not been time for him to return, and if he had returned, I must have seen him. I felt a faint chill, and my heart sank. And yet his going and coming were no affair of mine. I looked at him. I could not look away from his black figure and his white face. When he was exactly opposite to me, he turned and sent across the church straight into my eyes a look of hate, intense and deadly. I have never seen any other like it. Would to God I might never see it again. There he disappeared by the same door, through which I had watched him depart less than 60 seconds before. I sat and tried to collect my thoughts. My first sensation was like that of a very young child badly hurt when it catches its breath before crying out. To suddenly find myself the object of such hatred was exquisitely painful, and this man was an utter stranger. Why should he hate me so? Me, whom he had never seen before. For the moment, all other sensation was merged in this one pang. Even fear was subordinate to grief, and for that moment I never doubted. But in the next I began to reason, and a sense of the incongruous came to my aid. As I have said, St. Barnaby is a modern church. It is small and well lighted. One sees all over it almost at a glance. The organ gallery gets a strong white light from a row of long windows in the clerestory, which have not even colored glass. The pulpit being in the middle of the church, it followed that, when I was turned toward it, whatever moved at the west end could not fail to attract my eye. When the organist passed it was no longer that I saw him. I had simply miscalculated the interval between his first and his second passing. He had come in that last time by the other side door. As for the look which had so upset me, there had been no such thing, and I was a nervous fool. I looked about. This was likely place to harbor supernatural horrors. That clear-cut, reasonable face of Monseigneur C., his collected manner and easy, graceful gestures, were they not just a little discouraging to the notion of a gruesome mystery? I glanced above his head and almost laughed. That flyaway lady supporting one corner of the pulpit canopy, which looked like a fringed damask tablecloth in a high wind. At the first attempt of a basilisk to pose up there in the organ loft, she would point her gold trumpet at him and puff him out of existence. I laughed to myself over this conceit, which at the time I thought very amusing, and sat and chafed myself and everything else from the old harpy outside the railing who had made me 10 centimes for my chair, for she would let me in. She was more like a basilisk, I told myself, than was my organist with the anemic complexion. From that grim old dame to, yes, alas, Monseigneur C. himself, for all devoutness had fled. I had never yet done such a thing in my life, but now I felt a desire to mock. As for the sermon, I could not hear a word of it, for the jingle in my ears of the skirts of St. Paul is reached, having preached us those 6 Lent lectures. More unctuous than ever he preached, keeping time to the most fantastic and irreverent thoughts. It was no use to sit there any longer. I must get out of doors and shake myself free from this hateful mood. I knew the rudeness I was committing, but still I rose and I left the church. A spring sun was shining on the Rue Saint-Honoré as I ran down the church steps. On one corner stood a barrow full of yellow jonquils, pale violets from the Riviera, dark Russian violets, and white Roman hyacinths, and a golden cloud of mimosa. The street was full of Sunday pleasure seekers. I swung my cane and laughed with the rest. Someone overtook and passed me. He never turned, but there was the same deadly malignity in his white profile that there had been in his eyes. I watched him as long as I could see him. His lithe back expressed the same menace. Every step that carried him away from me seemed to bear on him some errand connected with my destruction. I was creeping along, my feet almost refusing to move. There began to dawn in me a sense of responsibility for something long forgotten. It began to seem as if I had deserved that which he threatened. It reached a long way back, a long, long way back. It had lain dormant all these years. It was there, though, and presently it would rise and confront me. But I would try to escape, and I stumbled as best I could into the Rue de Rivoli, across the Place de la Concorde, and onto the quay. I looked with sick eyes upon the sun, shining through the white foam of the fountain, pouring over the backs of the dusky bronze river gods, on the faraway arc, a structure of amethyst mist, on the countless vistas of gray stems and bare branches faintly green. Then I saw him again coming down one of the chestnut alleys of the Cours la Reine. I'm bad with foreign words, bad with French. I left the riverside, plunged blindly across the Champs-Élysées, and turned toward the Arc. The setting sun was sending its rays along the green sward of the Rond Point. In the full glow, he sat on a bench, children and young mothers all about him. He was nothing but a Sunday lounger like the others, like myself. I said the words almost aloud, and all the while I gazed on the malignant hatred of his face. But he was not looking at me. I crept past and dragged my leaden feet up the avenue. I knew that every time I met him brought him nearer to the accomplishment of his purpose and my fate. And still I tried to save myself. Yes, Tim, how dare you not know second tongues? The last rays of sunset were pouring through the great arc. I passed under it and met him face to face. I had left him far down the Champs-Élysées, and yet he came in with a stream of people who were returning from the Bois de Boulogne. French! He came so close that he brushed me. His slender frame felt like iron inside its loose black covering. He showed no signs of haste, nor of fatigue, nor of any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing, the will and the power to work me evil. I want to go to Louisiana. I just want to go from block to block and eat nothing but po' boys. It's a dream vacation of mine. Girlfriend wants to go to see all the horror stuff, the grave sites, all that. I want to go for the food. In anguish, I watched him where he went down the broad, crowded avenue. That was all flashing with wheels and the trappings of horses and the helmets of the Guard Republican. He was soon lost to sight. Then I turned and fled, into the boys and far out beyond it. I know not where I went, but after a long while, as it seemed to me, night had fallen, and I found myself sitting at a table before a small cafe. I had wandered back into the boys. It was hours now since I had seen him. Physical fatigue and mental suffering had left me no power to think or feel. I was tired, so tired. I longed to hide away in my own den. I resolved to go home, but that was a long way off. I live in the Court of the Dragon, a narrow passage that leads from the Rue de Rennes to the Rue de Dagon. Dude, never learned French, can't speak French. I took a quarter of it, I think, in high school. We did like a bit of German, bit of Spanish, bit of French. I was mostly in it to watch The Hunchback of Notre Dame and eat the croissants. It is an impasse traversable only for foot passengers. Over the entrance on the Rue de Rennes is a balcony supported by an iron dragon. Within the court, tall old houses rise on either side and close the ends that give onto the two streets. Huge gates swung back during the day into the walls of the deep archways close this court after midnight, and one must enter then by ringing at certain small doors on the side. The sunken pavement collects on savory pools. Steep stairways pitch down to doors that open on the court. The ground floors are occupied by shops of second-hand dealers and by iron workers. All day long, the place rings with the clink of hammers and the clang of metal bars. Unsavory as it is below, there is cheerfulness and comfort, and hard, honest work above. 5 flights up are the ateliers of architects and painters, and the hiding places of middle-aged students like myself who want to live alone. When I first came here to live, I was young and not alone. I had to walk a while before any conveyance appeared, but at last, when I had almost reached the Arc de Triomphe again, an empty cab came along and I took it. From the Arc to the Rue de Rennes is a drive of more than half an hour, especially when one is conveyed by a tired cab horse that has been at the mercy of Sunday fete makers. There had been time before I passed under the dragon's wings to meet my enemy over and over again, but I never saw him once, and now refuge was close at hand. Before the wide gateway, a small mob of children were playing. Our concierge and his wife walked among them with their black poodle, keeping order. Some couples were waltzing on the sidewalk. I returned their greetings and hurried in. All the inhabitants of the court had trooped out into the street. The place was quite deserted, lighted by a few lanterns hung high up, in which the gas burned dimly. My apartment was at the top of a house, halfway down the court, reached by a staircase that descended almost into the street, with only a bit of passageway intervening. I set my foot on the threshold of the open door. The friendly old ruinous stairs rose before me, leading up to the rest and shelter. Looking back over my right shoulder, I saw him, 10 paces off. He must have entered the court with me. He was coming straight on, neither slowly nor swiftly, but straight on to me. And now he was looking at me. For the first time since our eyes encountered across the church, they met now again, and I knew that the time had come. Retreating backward down the court, I faced him. I meant to escape by the entrance on the Rue des Dragons. His eyes told me that I never should escape. It seemed ages while we were going, I retreating, he advancing, down the court in perfect silence. But at last I felt the shadow of the archway, and the next step brought me within it. I had meant to turn here and spring through into the street, but the shadow was not that of an archway, it was that of a vault. The great doors on the Rue des Dragons were closed. I felt this by the blackness which surrounded me, and at the same instant I read it in his face. How his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly nearer. The deep vaults, the huge closed doors, their cold iron clamps were all on his side. The thing which he had threatened had arrived. It gathered and bore down on me from the fathomless shadows. The point from which it would strike was his infernal eyes. Hopeless, I sat my back against the barred doors and defied him. There was a scraping of chairs on the stone floor, and a rustling as the congregation rose. I could hear the Swiss's staff in the south aisle preceding Monsignor C. to the sacristy. The kneeling nuns, roused from their devout abstraction, made their reverence and went away. The fashionable lady, my neighbor, rose also with graceful reserve. As she departed, her glance just flitted over my face in disapproval. Half dead, or so it seemed to me, yet intensely alive to every trifle, I sat among the leisurely moving crowd, then rose too and went toward the door. I had slept through the sermon. Had I slept through the sermon? I looked up and saw him passing along the gallery to his place. Only his side I saw. The thin bent arm and its black covering looked like one of those devilish, nameless instruments which lie in the disused torture chambers of medieval castles. But I had escaped him, though his eyes had said I should not. Had I escaped him? That which gave him the power over me came back out of oblivion, where I had hoped to keep it, for I knew him now, death in the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him. They had changed him for every other eye, but not for mine. I had recognized him almost from the first. I had never doubted what he was come to do, and now I knew, while my body sat safe in the cheerful little church, he had been hunting my soul in the court of the dragon. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a blare. A dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away. The arches, the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes to the fathomless glare, and I saw the black stars hanging in the heavens, and the wet winds from the lake of Hali chilled my face. And now, far away, over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon dripping with spray, and beyond, the towers of Carcosa rose behind the moon. Death in the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago had sent him, had changed him for every other eye but mine. And now I heard his voice, rising, swelling, thundering through the flaring light. And as I fell, the radiance increasing, poured over me in waves of flame. Then I sank into the depths, and I heard the king in yellow whispering to my soul, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." That line's going to come up tomorrow. Euron's going to come up tomorrow. The Forsaken's going to come up tomorrow. You read that line, the fearful thing to fall in the hands of the living God. That's the damp hair right now. And that's what Euron's trying to get. Yeah, welp. But yeah, it's this foreboding, the king in yellow, the unknowable. And again, we have Carcosa on the shores of Lake Hali. relating that back to George R.R. Martin. Now, his Carcosa, if we look at the map, Carcosa sits on what's called the Hidden Sea. Lake Hali is a cloud lake. It is very foggy, very misty. It makes it almost an illusion that the city of Carcosa even exists. And with the Hidden Sea, that could be what George is going for. I have that more in my notes. Again, like, please, if you check out the stream with David Lightbringer tomorrow, I'm going to go more in all this, relating it more to A Song of Ice and Fire, and bringing it back to Lovecraft and his contemporaries, where I think George is going with that. So, and also, if you come to the stream, since it's me and Dave, Dave, I'm doing this for fun. Dave does this as the full time. So any PayPals, any super chats, save them all for tomorrow. Dave's saving up for a new computer so we can get back to the way he's been doing things. And with me as a guest, you're getting 2 answers for the price of 1, because any questions you send, I'm gonna weigh in on. I usually tend to, but yeah, it's like you get a 2-for-1 deal when you get a guest stream. Okay, so. So now we're going to move on to, I just created the stream for tomorrow. It's up. Oh, cool. Yeah. So after I'm done with this, I'll definitely, I'll tweet that out in after this one. So we're going to move on to the Yellow Sign. So this is a short story again. This is still Chambers. I'm just going to smoke weed and pet Cleo. That's him. My theory on King in Yellow okay. So I'll give a little sneak peek tomorrow. Okay, so I'm looking at more Hastur, but Nyarlathotep is, God, that's such a hard Nyarlathotep. Nyarlathotep. They're gonna come up. I'm glad you're here. We're having fun. Okay, so I'm gonna be relating it a lot to Hastur, but gonna bring up Euron's gonna come up because we're talking Lovecraft, and the Drowned God is just such an obvious Cthulhu reference. But I actually think Euron, with his rejection of actual Ironborn religion, because Euron's playing into the Ironborn religion, but he's using it as a means to an end. Like he more or less sees himself as above the culture itself. So I actually think that Euron actually can relate more to Hastur. And Hastur, he only gets one story with Lovecraft. Most of the Hastur Cthulhu mythos comes after Lovecraft's death with August Derleth. And Derleth is contentious, to say the least, among Lovecraft fans, but because he kind of, credit where credit is due. If it weren't for Derleth, we probably wouldn't have had a lot of these Lovecraft tales, but they wouldn't have been published. But I think Derleth's mistake was he was trying to create a pantheon of gods, if you will, and a hierarchy. So his mistake, I think, was in trying to make the unknowable knowable, and that's kind of losing the point. But in his stories, Hastur becomes kin to Cthulhu. He's like his half brother, but also his enemy. But even though he's enemy of Cthulhu, he also is octopoid in nature. So I'm going to bring up, I think that there's actually a couple connections with Euron and Hastur as the King in Yellow, using the King of Yellow as an earthly avatar. But we're gonna go. We'll go on that tomorrow with Dave when we're fully talking Song of Ice and Fire. And the Yellow Sign is then this is another chamber story, but the Yellow Sign is then adapted into the mythos. It becomes the cult symbol that the Brotherhood of the Yellow Sign uses when they are trying to summon Hastur. A lot of these things get adapted later. Church of Starry Wisdom's another thing that's lifted straight from Lovecraft. And that's That's another one that's going to go up. I had a whole section in my notes on specifically for Church of Starry Wisdom. Okay, so this is the yellow sign. Let the red dawn surmise what we shall do when this blue starlight dies and all is through. There are so many things which are impossible to explain. Why should certain chords in music make me think of the brown and golden tints of autumn foliage? Why should the mass of Saint Cecile bend my thoughts wandering among caverns whose walls blaze with ragged masses of virgin silver? What was it in the roar and turmoil of Broadway at 6 o'clock that flashed before my eyes, the picture of a still Breton forest where sunlight filtered through spring foliage and Sylvia bent, half curiously, half tenderly, over a small green lizard murmuring, to think that this also is a little ward of God. Huron sees himself. Yeah. It's like, oh yeah, I've been to Carth, so I know some things about some things. And maybe I don't think. Let's pause. I always want to talk shop. I don't think Euron actually went into Valyria. I think he might have just sat and floated on the silence, like outside the crumbling gates of Valyria, and forced some slaves in there to get whatever it is he found. But no, I don't think he actually. No way do I think that Euron actually set foot in there himself. Now, did he force them in? Did he skins change them to go in like a brand using Hodor thing? That I don't know. Euron's probably. I could see Euron telling them, be like, "Hey, go in there, get some things for me, and if you come back, I'll give you your freedom." And then they come, and then sends a bunch of guys in. Like 9 out of 10 of them die. One comes back with some cool shiny object. Euron takes it and kills them anyway. That's the way I see it going down with Euron getting things out of Valyria. But no, I don't. No way in hell did he set foot in there himself. He had someone doing the grunt work for him. I think a lot of us could agree on that one. But I'll give him the benefit of a doubt that he kind of sat outside and just kind of, paddled along in the waters outside of Valyria. Maybe he like someone who's about to play Ding Dong Ditch but can't go through with it, and they're so close to getting to the door, and their fingers right about to go on the doorbell, and then they chicken out and run away. Like Euron's probably sitting back in the water saying, "I'm going to stay back here and be lookout." That's the closest Euron's come to Valyria. Okay. We're going back to the yellow side. Right. When I first saw the watchman, his back was toward me. I looked at him indifferently until he went into the church. I paid no more attention to him than I had to any other man who lounged through Washington Square that morning. And when I shut my window and turned back into my studio, I'd forgotten him. Late in the afternoon, the day being warm, I raised the back into my studio. I'm sorry. The print in this book is very, very small. And I find myself reading the same line over because there's such a small width from line to line. All right. A man was standing in the courtyard of the church, and I noticed him again with as little interest as I had that morning. I looked across the square to where the fountain was playing, and then, with my mind filled with vague impressions of trees, asphalt drives, and the moving groups of nursemaids and holidaymakers, I started to walk back to my easel. As I turned, my listless glance included the man below in the churchyard. His face was toward me now, and with a perfectly involuntary movement, I bent to see it. At the same moment, he raised his head and looked at me. Instantly, I thought of a coffin worm. Whatever it was about the man that repelled me, I did not know, but the impression of a plump white grave worm was so intense and nauseating that I must have shown it in my expression, for he turned his puffy face away with a movement which made me think of a disturbed grub in a chestnut. I went back to my easel and motioned the model to resume her pose. After working a while, I was satisfied that I was spoiling what I had done as rapidly as possible, and I took up a palette knife and scraped the color out again. The flesh tones were sallow and unhealthy, and I did not understand how I could paint it such sickly color into a study which before that had glowed with healthy tones. I looked at Tessie. She had not changed, and the clear flush of health dyed her neck and cheeks as I frowned. Is it something I've done, she said. No. I've made a mess of this arm, and for the life of me, I can't see how I came to paint such mud as that into the canvas, I replied. Don't I pose well, she insisted. Of course, perfectly. Then it's not my fault? No, it's my own. I'm very sorry, she said. I told her she could rest while I applied rag and turpentine to the plague spot on my canvas, and she went off to smoke a cigarette and looked over the illustrations in the Courrier Français. I did not know whether it was something in the turpentine or a defect in the canvas, but the more I scrubbed, the more that gangrene seemed to spread. I worked like a beaver to get it out, and yet the disease appeared to creep from limb to limb of the study before me. Alarmed, I strove to arrest it, but now the color on the breast changed, and the whole figure seemed to absorb the infection as a sponge soaks up water. Vigorously, I applied palette knife, turpentine, and scraper, thinking all the time that what a seance I should hold with Duval, who had sold me the canvas. But soon I noticed that it was not the canvas which was defective, nor yet the colors of Edward. It must be the turpentine, I thought angrily, or else my eyes have become so blurred and confused by the afternoon light that I can't see straight. I called Tessie, the model. She came and leaned over my chair, blowing rings of smoke into the air. What have you been doing? She exclaimed. Nothing, I growled. It must be this turpentine. What a horrible color it is now, she continued. Do you think my flesh resembles green cheese? No, I don't, I said angrily. Did you ever know me to paint like that before? No, indeed. Well, then. It must be the turpentine or something, she admitted. She slipped on a Japanese robe and walked to the window. I scraped and rubbed until I was tired, and finally picked up my brushes and hurled them through the canvas with a forcible expression, the tone alone which reached Tessie's ears. Nevertheless, she promptly began. That's it. Swear and act silly and ruin your brushes. You have been 3 weeks on that study, and now look. What's good of ripping the canvas? What creatures artists are? I felt about as much ashamed as I usually did after such an outbreak, and I turned the ruined canvas to the wall. Tessie helped me clean my brushes and then danced away to dress. From the screen, she regaled me with bits of advice concerning whole or partial loss of temper, until thinking perhaps I had been tormented sufficiently, she came out to implore me to button her waist where she could not reach it on the shoulder. Everything went wrong from the time you came back from the window and talked about that horrid-looking man you saw in the churchyard, she announced. Yes, he probably bewitched the picture, I said, yawning. I looked at my watch. It's after 6, I know, said Tessie, adjusting her hat before the mirror. Yes, I replied. I didn't mean to keep you so long. I leaned out of the window, but recoiled with disgust, for the young man with the pasty face stood below in the churchyard. Tessie saw my gesture of disapproval and leaned from the window. Is that the man you don't like? She whispered. I nodded. I can't see his face, but he does look fat and soft. Some way or other, she continued, turning to look at me. He reminds me of a dream, an awful dream I once had. Or, she mused, looking down at her shapely shoes, was it a dream after all? How should I know? I smiled. Tessie smiled in reply. You were in it, she said, so perhaps you might know something about it. Tessie, I protested. Don't you dare flatter by saying that you dream about me. But I did, she insisted. Shall I tell you about it? Go ahead, I replied, lighting a cigarette. Tessie leaned back on the open windowsill and began very seriously. One night last winter, I was lying in bed, thinking about nothing at all in particular. I had been posing for you when I was tired out, yet it seemed impossible for me to sleep. I heard the bells in the city ring 10, 11, and midnight. I must have fallen asleep about midnight because I don't remember hearing the bells after that. It seemed to me that I had scarcely closed my eyes when I dreamed that something impelled me to go to the window. I rose and, raising the sash, leaned out. 25th Street was deserted as far as I could see. I began to be afraid. Everything outside seemed so black and uncomfortable. Then the sound of wheels in the distance came to my ears, and it seemed to me as though that was what I must wait for. Very slowly the wheels approached. and finally I could make out a vehicle moving along the street. It came nearer and nearer, and when it passed beneath my window, I saw it was a hearse. Then, as I trembled with fear, the driver turned and looked straight at me. When I awoke, I was standing by the open window shivering with cold, but the black-plumed hearse and the driver were gone. I dreamed this again in March last, and again awoke beside the open window. Last night the dream came again. You remember how it was raining. When I awoke, standing at the open window, my nightdress was soaked. But where did I come into the dream, I asked. You were in the coffin, but you were not dead. In the coffin? Yes. How did you know? Could you see me? No. I only knew you were there. Had you been eating Welsh rarebits or lobster salad? I began laughing, but the girl interrupted me with a frightened cry. Hello, what's up? I said as she shrank into the embrasure by the window. The man below in the churchyard. He drove the hearse. Nonsense, I said, but Tessie's eyes were wide with terror. I went to the window and looked out. The man was gone. Come, Tessie, I urged. Don't be foolish. You have posed too long. You are nervous. Do you think I could forget that face? She murmured. 3 times I saw the hearse pass below my window, and every time the driver turned and looked up at me. Oh, his face was so white and soft. It looked dead. It looked as if it had been dead a long time. I induced the girl to sit down and swallow a glass of Marsala. Then I sat down beside her and tried to give her some advice. Look here, Tessie, I said. You go to the country for a week or 2, and you'll have no more dreams about hearses. You pose all day, and when night comes, your nerves are upset. You can't keep this up. Then again, instead of going to bed when your day's work is done, you run off to picnics at Soldiers Park, or go to the El Dorado or Coney Island, and when you come down here next morning, you are fagged out. We're talking that word in early 20th century context. It's a cigarette. There was no real hearse. There was a soft shell crab dream. She smiled faintly. What about the man in the churchyard? Oh, he's only an ordinary, unhealthy, everyday creature. As true as my name is Tessie Reardon, I swear to you, Mr. Scott, that the face of the man below in the churchyard is the face of the man who drove the hearse. What of it? I said. It's an honest trade. Then you think I did see the hearse? Oh, I said diplomatically, if you really did, it might not be unlikely that the man below drove it. There is nothing in that. Tessie rose, unrolled her scented handkerchief, and taking a bit of gum from a knot in the hem, placed it in her mouth. Then drawing on her gloves, she offered me her hand with a frank good night, Mr. Scott, and walked out. Cancel! Cancel. It's too early in my career to be canceled. I'm just getting started. We're reading Lovecraft, okay? After Chambers, we're reading Lovecraft. Things might come up, okay? Okay, it's a talk that's been done to death, but Lovecraft was very racist. To the point where even the Grand Wizard of the KKK might look at Lovecraft and say, dude, you're going too far. Like, he was racist against other white people. Like, he took it to an extreme. You're not a real YouTuber until you've been canceled at least once. I mean, I have a 9 to 5, so, and we're not going to talk about what that is, so nobody knows what it is. We're having fun. All right. The next morning, Thomas the bellboy brought me the Herald and a bit of news. The church next door had been sold. I thanked heaven for it. Not that being a Catholic, I had any repugnance for the congregation next door, but because my nerves were shattered by a blatant exhorter, and whose every word echoed through the aisle of the church as if it had been my own rooms, and who insisted on his R's with a nasal persistence which revolted my every instinct. He rolls his R's. It's annoying to him. Then, too, there was a fiend in human shape, an organist, who reeled off some of the grand old hymns with an interpretation of his own, and I longed for the blood of a creature who could play the doxology with an amendment of minor chords which one hears only in a quartet of very young undergraduates. I believe the minister was a good man, but when he bellowed, and the Lord said unto Moses, this is how it is written with 3 R's, the Lord is a man of war. The Lord, praise Jesus. The Lord is his name. My wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword. I wondered how many centuries of purgatory it would take to atone for such a sin. Who bought the property? I asked Thomas. Nobody that I know, sir. They do say the gent what owns theirs. Hamilton Flats was looking at this guy speaking with a Cockney accent. Might be building more studios. I walked to the window. The young man with the unhealthy face stood by the churchyard gate, and by the mere sight of him, the same overwhelming repugnance took possession of me. By the way, Thomas, I said, who is that fellow down there? Thomas sniffed. That there worm, sir? It's night watchman of the church, sir. It makes me tired sitting out all night on them steps and looking at you insulting like. I punch his head, sir. Beg pardon, sir. Oh, go on, Thomas. One night I come and me with Ari and the other English boy. I see Alma sitting there on them steps. We had Molly and Jen with us, sir. The 2 girls on the tray service. I'm going to talk like this every time this guy speaks. And it looks so insulting at us, and I up and says, what you looking at, you fat slug? Beg pardon, sir, but that's how I says, sir. Then it don't say nothing, and I says, come out, and I'll punch that pudding in. Then I opens the gate and goes in, but don't say nothing, only looking insulting like. Then I sits him one, but ugh, is with that cold and mushy, it'd sicken you to touch him. What did he do then? I asked seriously. Him? Naughtin. And you, Thomas? The young fellow flushed with embarrassment and smiled uneasily. Mr. Scott, sir, I ain't no coward, and I ain't make it all the way I'll run. I was in the 5th Lancers, Sir Boga at Tel Ed Quebec, and I was shot by the wells. You don't mean to say you ran away? Yes, sir, I run. Why? That's just what I want to know, sir. I grabbed Molly and run, and the rest was as frightened as I. But what were they frightened at? Thomas refused to answer for a while, but now my curiosity was aroused about the repulsive young man below, and I pressed him. 3 years' sojourn in America had not only modified Thomas's Cockney dialect, but had given him the American's fear of ridicule. You won't believe me, Mr. Scott, sir. Yes, I will. You'll laugh at me, sir. Nonsense. And then he laughed, and then Alice Rivers exploded his head. He hesitated. Well, sir, it's God's truth that when I am led grabbing wrist, sir, and when I twisted his soft, musty fist, one of his fingers came off in the end. And he got his finger stuck in his bum. The utter loathing and horror of Thomas's face must have been reflected in my own, for he added, is other for now when I see him, I'm just go away. It makes me ill. When Thomas had gone, I went to the window. I don't think we're going to get any more of Thomas. The man stood beside the church railing with both hands on the gate, but I hastily retreated to my easel again, sickened and horrified, for I saw that the middle finger of his right hand was missing. Shit. All right. At 9 o'clock, Tessie appeared and vanished behind the screen with a merry, "Good morning, Mr. Scott." When she had reappeared and taken her pose upon the model stand, I started a new canvas, much to her delight. She remained silent as long as I was on the drawing, but as soon as the scrape of the charcoal ceased and I looked up my fixative, she began to chatter. Oh, I had such a lovely time last night. We went to Tony Pastor's. Who are we? I demanded. Oh, Maggie, you know, Mr. White's model, and Pinky McCormick. We call her Pinky because she's got that beautiful red hair you artists like so much. And Lizzie Burke. I sent a shower of spray from the fixative over the canvas and said, well, go on. We saw Kelly and Baby Barnes the skirt dancer and all the rest. I made a mash. Then you have gone back on me, Tessie. She laughed and shook her head. He's Lizzie Burke's brother, Ed. He's a perfect gentleman. I felt constrained to give her some parental advice concerning mashing, which she took with a bright smile. Oh, I can take care of a strange mash, she said, examining her chewing gum. But Ed is different. Lizzie is my best friend. Then she related how Ed had come back from the stocking mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, to find her and Lizzie grown up, and what an accomplished young man he was, and how he thought nothing of squandering $50 for ice cream and oysters to celebrate his entry as clerk into the woolen department of Macy's. I mean, a whole 50 cents on an ice cream bar. Inflation. Before she finished, I began to paint, and she resumed the pose, smiling and chattering like a sparrow. By noon, I had the study fairly well rubbed in, and Tessie came to look at it. That's better, she said. I am occasionally looking at the chat. We're having fun. Saying that, we're gonna say a lot. I'm actually gonna just give me a minute and all these words and shit. I can see why Dave always has the vitamin water handy. I remember when I could go into a candy store with $2 and OD. I can remember that. I thought too much and ate my lunch with a satisfied feeling that all was going well. Tessie spread her lunch on a drawing table opposite me, and we drank our claret from the same bottle and lighted our cigarettes from the same match. I was very much attached to Tessie. I had watched her shoot up into a slender but exquisitely formed woman from a frail, awkward child. She had posed for me during the last 3 years, and among all my models, she was my favorite. It would have troubled me very much indeed had she become tough or fly, as the favorite. These kids and their slang. Fly, as the phrase goes. But I never noticed any deterioration of her manner and felt at heart that she was all right. She and I never discussed morals at all, and I had no intention of doing so, partly because I had none myself, and partly because I knew she would do what she liked in spite of me. Like kids, I was young once. I smoked weed. I've tried heroin. I'm trying to lessen the amount of times I try heroin per day. That's a joke. I'm not a junkie. Numb's the word on the first stuff, though. I had a selfish desire to retain the best model I had. I knew that mashing, as she termed it, had no significance with girls like Tessie, and that such things in America did not resemble in the least the same things in Paris. Yet having lived with my eyes open, I also knew that somebody would take Tessie away someday, in one manner or another, and I thought I professed to myself that marriage was nonsense. I sincerely hoped that, in this case, there would be a priest at the end of the vista. I am a Catholic. When I listen to High Mass, when I sign myself, I feel that everything, including myself, is more cheerful. And when I confess, it does me good. A man who lives as much alone as I do must confess to somebody. Then again, Sylvia was Catholic, and it was reason enough for me. But I was speaking of Tessie, which is very different. Tessie was also Catholic and much more devout than I. So taking it all in all, I had little fear for my pretty model until she should fall in love. But then I knew that fate alone would decide her future for her, and I prayed inwardly that fate would keep her away from men like me and throw into her path nothing but Ed Burke's and Jimmy McCormick's. Bless her sweet face. Tessie sat blowing rings of smoke up the ceiling and tickling the ice in her tumbler. Do you know that I also had a dream last night? I observed. Not about that man, she laughed. Exactly. A dream similar to yours. Only much worse. I was foolish and thoughtless of me to say this, but you know how little tact the average painter has. I must have fallen asleep about 10 o'clock, I continued, and after a while I dreamt that I awoke. So plainly did I hear the midnight bells, the wind in the tree branches, and the whistle of streamers from the bay, that even now I can scarcely believe I was not awake. I seemed to be lying in a box which had a glass cover. Dimly I saw the street lamps as I passed, for I must tell you, Tessie, the box in which I reclined appeared to lie in a cushioned wagon which jolted me over a stony pavement. After a while, I became impatient and tried to move, but the box was too narrow. My hands were crossed on my breast, so I could not raise them to help myself. I listened and then tried to call. My voice was gone. I could hear the trample of the horses attached to the wagon, and even the breathing of the driver. Then another sound broke, upon my ears like the raising of a window sash. I managed to turn my head a little, and found I could look, not only through the glass cover of my box, but also through the glass panes in the side of the covered vehicle. I saw houses, empty and silent, with neither light nor life about any of them excepting one. In that house, a window was open on the first floor, and a figure all in white stood looking down into the street. It was you. Tessie had turned her face away from me and leaned on the table with her elbow. I could see your face, I resumed, and it seemed to me to be very sorrowful. Then we passed on and turned into a narrow black lane. Presently the horses stopped. I waited and waited, closing my eyes with fear and impatience, but all was silent as the grave. After what seemed to be hours, I began to feel uncomfortable. A sense that somebody was close to me made me unclose my eyes. Then I saw the white face of the hearse driver looking at me through the coffin lid. A sob from Tessie interrupted me. She was trembling like a leaf. I saw I had made an ass of myself and attempted to repair the damage. Why, Tessie, I said, I only told you this to show you what influence your story might have on another person's dreams. You don't suppose I really lay in a coffin, do you? What are you trembling for? Don't you see that your dream and my unreasonable dislike for that inoffensive watchman of the church simply set my brain working as soon as I fell asleep? She laid her head between her arms and sobbed as if her heart would break. What a precious triple donkey I had made of myself. But I was about to break my record. I went over and put my arm about her. Tessie, dear, forgive me, I said. I had no business to frighten you with such nonsense. You are too sensible a girl, too good a Catholic to believe in dreams. Her hand tightened on mine, and her head fell back upon my shoulder, but she still trembled, and I petted her and comforted her. Come, Tess, open your eyes and smile. Her eyes opened with a slow, languid movement and met mine, but their expression was so queer that I hastened to reassure her again. It's all humbug, Tessie. Bah, humbug! It's all humbug. You surely are not afraid that any harm will come to you because of that. No, she said, but her scarlet lips quivered. Then what's the matter? Are you afraid? Yes, not for myself. For me, then? I demanded gaily. For you, she murmured in a voice almost inaudible. I care for you. At first, I started to laugh, but when I understood her, a shock passed through me, and I sat like one turned to stone. This was the crowning bit of idiocy I had committed. During the moment when she lapsed between her reply and my answer, I thought of 1,000 responses to that innocent confession. I could pass by it with a laugh. I could misunderstand her and assure her as to my health. I could simply point out that it was impossible she could love me. But my reply was quicker than my thoughts, and I might think now when it was too late, for I had kissed her on the mouth. That evening, I took my usual walk in Washington Park, pondering over the occurrences of the day. I was thoroughly committed. There was no back out now, and I stared the future straight in the face. I was not good, not even scrupulous, but I had no idea of deceiving either myself or Tessie. The one passion of my life lay buried in the sun-lit forests of Brittany. Was it buried forever? Hope cried no. For 3 years I had been listening to the voice of hope, and for 3 years I had waited for a footstep on my threshold. Had Sylvia forgotten? No, cried Hope. I said that I was no good. That is true, but still I was not exactly a comic opera villain. I had led an easygoing, reckless life, taking what invited me of pleasure, deploring and sometimes bitterly regretting consequences. Hi, Damon. You want to be on stream? And one thing alone, except my painting, was I serious, and that was something which lay hidden, if not lost, in the Breton forests. That's right here. Sit down on the recliner next to Daddy. But it was too late for me to regret what had occurred during the day. Whatever it had been, pity, a sudden tenderness for sorrow, or the more brutal instinct of gratified vanity, it was all the same now, and unless I wished to bruise an innocent heart, my path lay marked before me. The fire and strength, the depth of passion of a love which I had never even suspected, with all my imagined experience in the world, left me no alternative but to respond or send her away. Whether because I am so cowardly about giving pain to others, or whether it was that I have little of the gloomy Puritan in me, I do not know, but I shrank from disclaiming responsibility for that thoughtless kiss, and in fact had no time to do so before the gates of her heart opened and the flood poured forth. Others who habitually do their duty and find a sullen satisfaction in making themselves and everybody else unhappy might have withstood it. I did not. I dared not. After the storm had abated, I did tell her that she might better have loved Ed Burke and worn a plain gold ring, and she would not hear of it. And I thought perhaps as long as she had decided to love somebody she could not marry, it had better be me. I at least could treat her with an intelligent affection, and whenever she became tired of her infatuation, she could go none the worse for it. For I was decided on that point, although I knew how hard it would be. I remembered the usual termination of platonic liaisons, and thought how disgusted I had been whenever I heard of one. I knew I was undertaking a great deal for so unscrupulous a man as I was, and I dreamed the future, but never but for one moment did I doubt that she was safe with me. Had it been anybody but Tessie, I should not have bothered my head about scruples, for it did not occur to me to sacrifice Tessie as I would have sacrificed a woman of the world. I looked the future squarely in the face and saw the several probable endings to the affair. She would either tire of the whole thing or become so unhappy that I should have either to marry her or go away. If I married her, we would be unhappy. I with a wife unsuited to me, and she with a husband unsuitable for any woman. For my past life could scarcely entitle me to marry. If I went away, she might either fall ill, recover, and marry some Eddie Burke, or she might recklessly or deliberately go and do something foolish. On the other hand, if she tired of me, then her whole life would be before her, with beautiful vistas of Eddie Burkes and marriage rings and twins and Harlem flats and heaven knows what. As I strolled through the trees by the Washington Ark, I decided that she should find a substantial friend in me anyway, and the future could take care of itself. Damon. Okay, your paws are wrapped around the wires. Pets, am I right? It's Damon. Okay. This is Damon, and as you can tell, he's black, but the very, very tip of his tail, he's got this white tip. At the shelter, he was originally named Dumbledore because his tail looks like a magic wand. For me, I look at it as like it's a little flame tip. So he's Damon Blackfire, but he's a bit of a rogue. So we got Damon Targaryen in him. You're gonna watch House of the Dragon with me. You're gonna see your namesake. Actually, let's take a pause. One thing I did was the first night I brought him home, I set out my copy of Fire and Blood and A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms to see which one he would walk to. Because so Fire and Blood would be Daemon Targaryen, and Knight of Seven Kingdoms, the Duncan Eggtails. That would be where we get our mentions of Daemon Blackfire, especially we get the second Blackfire Rebellion. He walked the first one he walked towards and stood on top of the Duncan Eggtail. So he's a Duncan Egg boy, which I guess means you're taking Blackfire for your own, the same way Daemon Blackfire did. I guess that makes me Aegon the Fourth, but I don't think I would like to think I'd be a better king than that. All right. Then I went into the house and put on my evening dress, for the little faintly perfumed notes on my dresser said, "Have a cab at the stage door at 11," and the note was signed, "Edith Carmichael, Metropolitan Theater." I took supper that night, or rather we took supper, Miss Carmichael and I, at Celephaïs, and the dawn was just beginning to gild the cross on that memorial church as I entered Washington Square after leading Edith at the Brunswick. There was not a soul in the park as I passed along the trees, and I took the walk which leads from the Garibaldi statue to the Hamilton apartment house. But as I passed the churchyard, I saw a figure sitting on the stone steps. In spite of myself, a chill crept over me at the sight of the white puffy face, and I hastened to pass. Then he said something which might have been addressed to me, or might merely have been a mutter to himself. But a sudden, furious anger flamed up within me that such a creature should address me. For an instant, I felt like wheeling about and smashing my stick over his head. But I walked on, and entering the Hamilton, went to my apartment. For some time, I tossed about the bed, trying to get the sound of his voice out of my ears, but could not. It filled my head, that muttering sound, like thick, oily smoke from a fat rendering vat, or an odor of noisome decay. And as I lay and tossed about, the voice in my ears seemed more distinct, and I began to understand the words he had muttered. They came to me slowly, as if I had forgotten them, and at last I could make some sense of the sounds. It was this. Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign? Have you found the yellow sign? I was furious. What did he mean by that? Then, with a curse upon him and his, I rolled over and went to sleep. But when I awoke later, I looked pale and haggard, for I had dreamed the dream of the night before, and it troubled me more than I cared to think. I dressed and went down into my studio. Tessie sat by the window, but as I came in, she rose and put both arms around my neck for an innocent kiss. She looked so sweet and dainty that I kissed her again, and then sat down before the easel. Hello, where's the study I began yesterday? I asked. Tessie looked conscientious, but did not answer. I began to hunt among the piles of canvases, saying, hurry up, Tess, and get ready. We must take advantage of the morning light. Excuse me. It's cold season in the Great Waste. Real life, I live in eastern Pennsylvania, and tomorrow night when I go with Dave, we're expecting, it keeps changing. It started from 8 to 12, then it went to 5 to 8, now we're 3 to 5, but we're expecting I'm going to say probably 5 inches of snow tomorrow. Oh yeah, I got cases of water. I'm good, thank you. I've lived in Pennsylvania all my life, so 20-inch snowstorms are not new to me. They become, you spend enough years here, it becomes par for the course. When at last I gave up the search among the other canvases and turned to look around the room for the missing study, I noticed Tessie standing by the screen with her clothes still on. What's the matter? I asked. Don't you feel well? Yes. Then hurry. Do you want me to pose as I always posed? Then I understood. Here was a new complication. I had lost, of course, the best nude model I had ever seen. I looked at Tessie. Her face was scarlet. Alas, alas, we had eaten of the tree of knowledge, and Eden and native innocence were dreams of the past. I mean for her. I suppose she noticed the disappointment on my face, for she said, I will pose if you wish. The study is behind the screen where I put it. No, I said, we will begin something new. And I went into my wardrobe and picked out a Moorish costume which fairly blazed with tinsel. It was a genuine costume, and Tessie retired to the screen with it enchanted. When she came forth again, I was astonished. Her long black hair was bound above her forehead with a circlet of turquoise, and the ends curled about her glittering girdle. Her feet were encased in the embroidered pointed slippers, and the skirt of her costume, curiously wrought with arabesques in silver, fell to her ankles. The deep metallic blue vest embroidered with silver, and the short Morris jacket spanged and sewn with turquoises become her wonderfully. She came to me and held up her face smiling. I slipped my hand into my pocket and, drawing out a gold chain with a cross attached, dropped it over her head. My shoes off when I sit outside. I have to kick my shoes off when I come inside, lest I drag more snow through my house. I have boots set right at the door because for this. It's yours, Tessie. Mine, she faltered. Yours. Now go and pose. Then, with a radiant smile, she ran behind the screen and presently reappeared with a little box on which was written my name. I had intended to give it to you when I went home tonight, she said, but I can't wait now. I opened the box. On the pink cotton inside lay a clasp of black onyx, on which was inlaid a curious symbol or letter in gold. It was neither Arabic nor Chinese, nor, as I found afterwards, did it belong to any human script. It's all I had to give you for a keepsake, she said timidly. I was annoyed, but I told her how much I should prize it, and promised to wear it always. She fastened it on my coat beneath the lapel. How foolish, Tess, to go and buy me such a beautiful thing as this, I said. I did not buy it, she laughed. Where did you get it? Then she told me how she had found it one day while coming from the aquarium in the Battery. How she had advertised it and watched the papers, but at last gave up all hopes of finding the owner. This was last winter, she said, the very day I had that first horrid dream about the hearse. Peter, don't hook up with your models, otherwise you'll be dealing with... Yes. Speak. I think that probably should go without saying. If you're an employer of any kind, don't sleep with your employees. It's keep it professional. Do your best to keep it professional. I'm not a Puritan, though. You're all adults. I can't control what you just do. I just try and tell you, hey, try. Don't, guys, don't think with your dick. It will get you into trouble. That was last winter, she said, the very day I had the first horrid dream about the hearse. I remembered my dream of the previous night, but said nothing, and presently my charcoal was flying over a new canvas, and Tessie stood motionless on the model stand. I love you, boy. The day following was a disastrous one for me. While moving a framed canvas from one easel to another, my foot slipped on the polished floor, and I fell heavily on both wrists. They were so badly sprained that it was useless to attempt to hold a brush, and I was obliged to wander about the studio, glaring at unfinished drawings and sketches, until despair seized me, and I sat down to smoke and twiddle my thumbs with rage. The rain blew against the windows and rattled on the roof of the church, driving me into a nervous fit with its interminable patter. Tessie sat sewing by the window, and every now and then raised her head and looked at me for something to occupy me. I had read all the papers and all the books in the library, but for the sake of something to do, I went to the bookcases and shoved them open with my elbow. I knew every volume by its color and examined them all, passing slowly around the library and whistling to keep up my spirits. I was turning to go into the dining room when my eye fell upon a book bound in serpent skin, standing in a corner on the top shelf of the last bookcase. I did not remember it, and from the floor could not decipher the pale lettering on the back, so I went to the smoking room and called Tessie. She came in from the studio and climbed up to reach the book. What is it? I asked. The King in Yellow. I was dumbfounded. Who had placed it there? How it came into my room? I had long ago decided that I should never open that book, and nothing on earth could have persuaded me to buy it. Fearful lest curiosity might tempt me to open it, I had never even looked at it in bookstores. If I ever had any curiosity to read it, the awful tragedy of young Castaigne, whom I knew, prevented me from exploring its wicked pages. I had always refused to listen to any description of it, and indeed, nobody ever ventured to discuss the second part out loud. So I had absolutely no knowledge of what those leaves might reveal. I stared at the poisonous mottled binding as I would a snake. Don't touch it, Tessie, I said. Come down. Of course, my admonition was enough to arouse her curiosity, and before I could prevent it, she took the book and, laughing, danced off into the studio with it. I called to her, but she slipped away with a tormenting smile at my helpless hands, and I followed her with some impatience. Tessie, I cried, entering the library. Listen, I am serious. Put that book away. I do not wish you to open it. Don't read the Necronomicon. It's really what we're saying. Don't read the King in Yellow. Don't read the Necronomicon. Don't fuck with the Ouija board, okay? Bad shit happens. Don't. It's like that phrase. I love that scene in what's that movie? Cabin in the Woods, where the one dude is like, I vote that we don't read the fucking Latin. The stoned man was the smart man. Put that book away. I do not wish you to open it. The library was empty. I went into both drawing rooms, then into the bedrooms, laundry, kitchen, and finally returned to the library and began a systematic search. She had hidden herself so well that it was half an hour later when I discovered her crouching white and silenced by the lattice window in the storeroom above. At first glance, I saw she had been punished for her foolishness. The King in Yellow lay at her feet, but the book was open at the second part. I looked at Tessie and saw it was too late. She had opened the King in Yellow. Then I took her by the hand and led her into the studio. She seemed dazed, and when I told her to lie down on the sofa, she obeyed me without a word. And after a while, she closed her eyes and her breathing became regular and deep. But I could not determine whether or not she slept. For a long while, I sat silently beside her, but she neither stirred nor spoke, and at last I rose, and entering the unused storeroom, took the book in my least injured hand. It seemed heavy as lead, but I carried it into the studio again, and sitting down on the rug beside the sofa, opened it and read it through from beginning to end. When faint with excess of my emotions, I dropped the volume and leaned warily back against the sofa. Tessie opened her eyes and looked at me. We had been speaking for some time at a dull, monotonous strain before I realized that we were discussing the King in Yellow. Oh, the sin of writing such words, which are clear as crystal, limpid and musical, as bubbling springs, words which sparkle and glow like the poisoned diamonds of the Medicis. Oh, the wickedness, the hopeless damnation of a soul who could fascinate and paralyze human creatures with such words. Words understood by the ignorant and wise alike, words which are more precious than jewels, more soothing than music, more awful than death. We talked on, unmindful of the gathering shadows, and she was begging me to throw away the clasp of a black onyx, quaintly inlaid with what we now knew to be the yellow sign. I never shall know why I refused, even at this hour, here in my bedroom as I write this confession, I should be glad to know what it was that prevented me from tearing the yellow sign from my breast and casting it into the fire. I am sure I wished to do so, and yet Tessie pleaded with me in vain. Night fell and the hours dragged on, but still we murmured to each other of the king and the pallid mask, and the midnight sounded from the misty spires to the fog-wrapped city. We spoke of Hastur and of Casilda, while outside the fog rolled against the blank window panes as the cloud waves roll and break on the shores of Hali. The house was very silent now, and not a sound came up from the misty streets. Tessie lay among the cushions, her face a gray blot in the gloom, but her hands were clasped in mine, and I knew that she knew and read my thoughts as I read hers, for we had understood the mystery of the Hyades, and the phantom of truth was laid. Then as we answered each other, swiftly, silently, thought on thought, the shadows stirred in the gleam about us, and far in the distant streets we heard a sound. Nearer and nearer it came, the dull crunching of wheels, nearer and yet nearer, and now, outside before the door it ceased, and I dragged myself to the window and saw a black-plumed hearse. The gate below opened and shut, and I crept shaking to my door and bolted it, but I knew no bolts, no locks could keep that creature out who was coming for the yellow sign. And now I heard him moving very softly along the hall. Now he was at the door, and the bolts rotted at his touch. Now he had entered. With eyes starting from my head, I peered into the darkness, but when he came into the room, I did not see him. It was only when I felt him envelop me in his cold, soft grasp that I cried out and struggled with deadly fury. but my hands were useless, and he tore the onyx clasp from my coat and struck me full in the face. Then as I fell, I heard Tessie's soft cry, and her spirit fled. And even while falling, I longed to follow her, for I knew that the King in Yellow had opened his tattered mantle, and there was only God to cry to now. I could tell more, but I cannot see what help it will be to the world. As for me, I am past human help or hope. As I lie here, writing, careless even whether or not I die before I finish, I can see the doctor gathering up his powders and piles with a vague gesture to the good priest beside me, which I understand. They will be very curious to know the tragedy, they of the outside world who write books and print millions of newspapers, but I shall write no more, and the Father Confessor will seal my last words with the seal of sanctity with it when his holy office is done. They of the outside world may send their creatures into wrecked homes and death-smitten firesides, and their newspapers will batten on blood and tears, but with me their spies must halt before the confessional. They know that Tessie is dead and that I am dying. They know how the people in the house, aroused by an infernal scream, rushed into my room and found one living and two dead, but they do not know what I shall tell them now. They do not know that the doctor said as he pointed to a horrible decomposed heap on the floor, the living corpse of the watchman from the church. I have no theory, no explanation. That man must have been dead for months. I think I am dying. I wish the priest would. And then it cuts out. That's the end of the story. That's the yellow sign. Yeah. So this is the thing with stories say, like, and George does this a lot, like, but that's a story for another day, or we shall not spend more time with, like, no, spend more time. I want to know. And that's a sign that George is saving it for later. We see that a lot with, like, Blackfire rebellions and stuff, like how he had says, like, we know much of the actions of Maekar, the bravery of Aegon, and certain deeds by Aerion Brightflame. It's like, no, we don't. We don't know shit. Tell us, George. I think Aerion Brightflame killed Hagon Blackfire. I think when Hagon Blackfire submitted his sword and was killed treacherously, I don't think it was Bloodraven. I'm saying that Aerion Brightflame is the one who did that, and those are the certain actions that he has remembered. Maybe even some other atrocities. Third Blackfire Rebellion seems like it was the Blackfire's best chance to get at it. But now we're going to Lovecraft. And let's see. I wrote the page numbers down. This is it's over 1,000 pages. So I wrote my page numbers down for the stories we're going to do. Okay. So we're going to start with the doom that came to Sarnath. Yeah. I think Aerion Brightflame, Third Blackfire Rebellion has Bloodraven, Aerion Brightflame, and Aegon. This is after Aegon has come of age, and all of them, and Sir Duncan the Tall. They all fight in the Third Blackfire Rebellion, and we're told that Hagon Blackfire, who Bittersteel had crowned, that he gave up, and he gave up his sword, like that's a sign, like, I surrender. But he was, even after surrendering, he was killed. And it also says that Aerion Brightflame, while Aegon is remembered for bravery, Aerion Brightflame is remembered for certain actions, which seems to be like just a very nice way of saying Aerion Brightflame did some horrid shit during this war. So I think Aerion is the one that killed Hagon. I think he basically killed him. He killed a man who had surrendered, and we see Bloodraven never killed a man surrendered. Bloodraven did break guest right by killing Amy's Blackfire. But no, I think when it comes to the third Blackfire Rebellion and who killed Hagon Blackfire, I'm on the it was Arian. Arian did it. That's my belief. That's my theory. If we do this more often, we can read more. Like some of these are very short, some of these are very long. Like when I originally envisioned doing this, I was thinking, let's read a dream quest of unknown Kadath, because Kadath's going to be another one of those cities that we're thinking that we're going to be talking about tomorrow. But that's 100 pages long. I don't think I have it in me to sit here and read one story. No, we're going with some shorter ones. Also, I wanted to get Bierce and Chambers in here, get this whole see how like we leapfrog from Bierce to Chambers to Lovecraft, and then up into present day with George and what he's doing. I wanted to lay a foundation for Carcosa and the King in Yellow, because it's gonna come up a lot. Okay, but here we're hour and 48 minutes into the stream, and we're finally getting into the Lovecraft. But here we're going to start with the doom that came to Sarnath. There is in the land of Nar, again, pronunciations vary. This is spelled M-N-A-R. I'm going to pronounce it Nar. Okay. A vast still lake that is fed by no stream, and out of which no stream flows. 10,000 years ago there stood by its shores the mighty city of Sarnath. But Sarnath stands there no more. It is told that in the immemorial years, when the world was young, before ever the men of Sarnath came to the land of Nar, another city stood beside the lake, the gray stone city of Ib, which was old as the lake itself, and peopled with beings not pleasing to behold. Very odd and ugly were these beings, as indeed are most beings of a world yet inchoate and rudely fashioned. It is written on the brick cylinders of Kadatheron that the beings of Ib were in hue as green as the lake and the mists that rise above it, that they had bulging eyes, pouting, flapping lips, and curious ears, and were without voice. It is also written that they descended one night from the moon in a mist, that they and the vast still lake and gray stone city Ib. However this may be, it is certain that they worshipped a sea green stone idol chiseled in the likeness of a Baccarog, the great water lizard, before which they danced horribly when the moon was gibbous. And we see these things with George. So they got a sea green stone idol chiseled into the likeness of a water lizard. And George, we're going to see like the oily black stone, Isle of Toads. It's chiseled into a toad statue. Iron Islands, the sea stone chair. You can see like this is you can see where George is getting these ideas from. And then, of course, we have Ib. Ib appears in Song of Ice and Fire. We have the Men of Ib. Kind of like George playing with the idea of diverging evolutions. Some see Ib as like a form of Neanderthal. Another thing that George does is, because he's also coming off of Lovecraft and history, we're going to talk a lot. We'll talk a lot of history. I got a lot of comparisons of Great Empire to the fall of Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde and stuff. But Lovecraft, real world history, and Tolkien. And George also plays with the fantasy races. And for me, like the Men of Ib and George's story, I kind of see as like the Ibonese are kind of like his take on dwarves. Just kind of like Valyrians are almost elvish in a way. And the brindle men of Sithorios, the way they're described, they seem like that's like orcs. That's George's orcs. Yeah. So, and then Sarnath. We in George's story, there's the Sarnori kingdoms, and Sarnath. Also, the way Sarnath described it makes me think of what once was the patrimony of Harkoon before the dry times, when it was a lush, vibrant nation, but now has receded into 3 sister cities that sit in like these dried up lake beds that sit at the three roads that lead to the bones. There's many roads that lead over the bones, but only 3 that are considered quote unquote they're safe. You know, the more guaranteed way to get through. Otherwise, you're just trying to climb over crevices and pitfalls, and you don't know where you're going to actually end up. The bones are a monster to get through. That's why you need a Sherpa. That's why Dave's having me with for tomorrow. We're going to go when we go over the bournes and through the forts to the gray waste. We go. Grandma lives out there with the wolves, the gaunt wolves on their haunches. All right. And it is written in the papyrus of Ellerneck that they one day discovered fire and thereafter kindled flames on many ceremonial occasions. But not much is written of these beings, because they lived in very ancient times, and man is young and knows but little of the very ancient living things. The bones are like from Sahara. The bones seem like more like the Himalayas, like. Well, they're like a mix of mountain ranges. They're the Rockies, the Himalayas, and just because there are parts of the bones that are desert mountains, but then there's also snow-capped peaks. They're the even I'm forgetting the exact Dothraki words, but they translate to the white bones where the snow-capped ones are, and the dry bones, which is where like the desert portion that leads out into the sand road where there's like very, very little water. And then there's the sand road, the stone road, and the steel road, which are guarded by the three sister cities that Kaya Naya. I'd have to pull up my notes. They're like some of the more complicated names George gave for places. But there's three sister cities that make up the remainder of the patrimony of Harkoon. That are guarded by warrior women because they believe that only those who give birth have the right to take life at will. And we're going. I got thoughts on that. I got an idea on where George is going. This is all stuff for tomorrow. Come see. We'll talk. We're going to talk a lot of shop tomorrow. Me and Dave. Come with your questions. Come with your super chats, your PayPals. Again, you're going to get 2 answers for the price of 1. But further east, that along with Blackfire Rebellions, definitely my favorite bits of extended lore. Like we're going to very, very back pages of World of Ice and Fire tomorrow. Like put on your tinfoil helmets tomorrow because we're going places. Because we're going to be going outside the World of Ice and Fire into the pages of Chambers of Lovecraft, really trying to get at what George is doing with these fun Easter eggs. After many aeons, men came to the land of Nar, dark shepherd folk with their fleecy flocks, who built Thrall, Illerneck, and Kadatheron on the winding river Eye. The Valyrians were supposed to be shepherds, and the river Eye, a shy. George, you tricky trick. And certain tribes more hardy than the rest pushed on to the border of the lake and built Sarnath at a spot where precious metals were found in the earth. Not far from the gray city of Ib did the wandering tribes lay the first stones of Sarnath, and at the beings of Ib they marveled greatly. But with their marveling was mixed hate, for they thought it not meant that beings of such aspect should walk about the world of men at dusk. Nor did they like the strange sculptures upon the gray monoliths of Ib, for those sculptures were terrible, with great antiquity. Why the beings in the sculptures lingered so late in the world, even until the coming of men, none can tell, unless it was because the land of Nar had very still and remote from the most of other lands, both of waking and of dream. As the men of Sarnath beheld more of the beings of Ib, their hate grew, and it was not less because they found the beings weak and soft as jelly to the touch of stones and spears and arrows. So one day the young warriors, the slingers and the spearmen and the bowmen, marched against Ib and slew all the inhabitants thereof, pushing the queer bodies into the lake with long spears, because they did not wish to touch them. And because they did not like the gray sculptured monoliths of Ib, they cast these also into the lake, wandering from the greatness of the labor, however the stones were brought from afar, as they must have been, since there is not like them in all the land of Nar or in the lands adjacent. Thus of the very ancient city of Ib was nothing spared, save the sea-green stone idol chiseled in the likeness of Balrog, the water lizard. This the young warriors took back with them to Sarnath as a symbol of conquest over the old gods and beings of Ib, and a sign of leadership in Nar. So this is like the Dothraki when they have those sphinxes that are on wheel, like the one great sphinx is missing because the Dothraki, after sacking it, kind of put it up on wagon wheels and they took it back with them to base Dothrak. The men of Sarnath are doing the same thing, taking this sculpture from after killing all of the men of Ib. But on the night after it was set up in the temple, a terrible thing must have happened, for weird lights were seen over the lake, and in the morning the people found the idol gone, and the high priest Taranish lying dead, as from some fear unshakable. And before he died, Taranish had scrawled upon the altar of chrysolite in coarse shaky strokes the sign of doom. After Taranish there were many high priests in Sarnath, but never was the sea-green stone idol found. And many centuries came and went, wherein Sarnath prospered exceedingly, so that only priests and old women remembered when Taranish had scrawled upon the altar of chrysolite. Betwixt Sarnath and the city of Elernek arose a caravan route, and the precious metals from the earth were exchanged for other metals and rare cloths and jewels and books and tools, for artificers and all things of luxury that are known to the people who dwell along the winding river Ai and beyond. So Sarnath waxed mighty and learned and beautiful, and sent forth conquering armies to subdue the neighboring cities. And in time there sate upon the throne in Sarnath the kings of all the land of Nar and many lands adjacent. The wonder of the world and the pride of all mankind was Sarnath the magnificent. Of polished desert quarried marble were its walls, in height 300 cubits, and in breadth 75, so that chariots might pass each other as men drove them along the top. For a full 500 stadia did they run, being open only on the side toward the lake, where a green stone seawall kept back the waves that rode Osley once a year at the festival of the destroying of Ib. In Sarnath were 50 streets from the lake to the gates of the caravans, and in 50 more intersecting them. With onyx were they paved, save those wherein the horses and camels and elephants trod, which were paved with granite. And the gates of Sarnath were as many as the landward ends of the street, each of bronze, and flanked by the figures of lions and elephants, carven from some stone no longer known among men. The houses of Sarnath were of glazed brick and chalcedony. I don't know this word. We all have had that moment in school where we come across a word that we don't know, so we're just going to skip it. But it's spelled Chalcedony. If anyone knows how to pronounce that, you tell me later. Each having its walled guarded and crystal lakelet. With strange art were they built, for no other city had houses like them, and travelers from Thraw and Ilernik and Kadath marveled at the shining domes wherewith they were surmounted. But more marvelous still were the palaces and the temples and the gardens made by Zokar, the olden king. There were many places, the least of which were mightier than any in Thra or Ilernek or Kadath. So high were they that within one might sometimes fancy himself beneath only the sky. Yet when lighted with torches dipped in the oil of Dothur, their walls shewed vast paintings of kings and armies, of a splendor at once inspiring and stupefying to the beholder. Many were the pillars of the palaces, all of tinted marvel, and carven into designs of surpassing beauty. And in most of the palaces, the floors were mosaics of beryl and lapis lazuli and sardonyx and carbuncle and other choice materials, so disposed that the beholder might fancy himself walking over beds of the rarest flowers. And there were likewise fountains, which cast scented waters about in pleasing jets arranged with cunning art. Outshining all others was the palace of the kings of Nar and of the lands adjacent. On a pair of golden crouching lions rested the throne, many steps above the gleaming floor, and it was wrought of one piece of ivory, though no man lives who knows whence so vast a piece could have come. In that palace there were so many galleries and many amphitheaters where lions and men and elephants battled at the pleasure of the kings. Sometimes the amphitheaters were flooded with water conveyed from the lake in mighty aqueducts, and then were enacted stirring sea fights or combat between swimmers and deadly marine things. Lofty and amazing were the 17 tower-like temples of Sarnath, fashioned of a bright multicolored stone not known elsewhere. A full 1,000 cubits high stood the greatest among them, wherein the high priest dwelt with a magnificence scarce less than that of the kings. On the grounds were halls as vast and splendid as those of the palaces, where gathered throngs in worship of Zokalar and Tamash and Laban and the chief gods of Sarnath, whose incense enveloped shrines were as the thrones of monarchs. Not like the icons of other gods were those of Zokalar and Tamash and Laban, for so close to life were they that one might swear the graceful bearded gods themselves sate on the ivory thrones. And up unending steps of shining zircon was the tower chamber, wherefrom the high priest looked out over the city and the plains and the lake by day, and at the cryptic moon and significant stars and planets and their reflections in the lake by night. Here was done the very secret and ancient rite in detestation of Bakrog, the water lizard, and here rested the altar of chrysolite which bore the doom scrawl of Toranash. Wonderful likewise were the gardens made by Zokar the olden king. In the center of Sarnath they lay, covering a great space and encircled by a high wall, and they were surmounted by a mighty dome of glass, through which shone the sun and moon and stars and planets when it was clear, and from which were hung fulgent images of the sun and moon and stars and planets when it was not clear. In summer, the gardens were cooled with fresh odorous breezes, skillfully wafted by fans, and in winter they were heated with concealed fires, so that in those gardens it was always spring. There ran little streams over bright pebbles, dividing meads of green garden and many hues, and spanned by a multitude of bridges. Many were the waterfalls in their courses, and many were the lilied lakelets into which they expanded. Over the streams and lakelets rode white swans, whilst the music of rare birds chimed in, and the melody of the waters. In ordered terraces rose the green banks, adorned here and there with bowers of vines and sweet blossoms, and seats and benches of marble and porphyry. And there were many small shrines and temples where one might rest or pray to small gods. Each year there was celebrated in Sarnath the feast of the destroying of Ib, at which time wine, song, dancing, and merriment of every kind abounded. Great honors were then paid to the shades of those who had annihilated the odd ancient beings, and the memory of those beings and of their elder gods was derided by dancers and lutenists crowned with roses from the gardens of Zokar. And the kings would look out over the lake and curse the bones of the dead that lay beneath it. At first the high priest liked not these festivals, for there had descended amongst them queer tales of how the sea green icon had vanished, and how Toranash had died from fear and left a warning. And they said that from that high tower they sometimes saw lights beneath the waters of the lake. But as many years passed without calamity, even the priests laughed and cursed and joined in the orgies of the feasters. Indeed, had they not themselves in their high tower often performed the very ancient and secret rite in detestation of Buckrug, the water lizard. And 1,000 years of riches and delight passed over Sarnath, wonder of the world and pride of all mankind. There's a lot of great empire ideas here, with these mass orgies and the high priests who are against it but then come to love it and actually taking part in it, and this casting down of the gods of Ib, but also the disappearance of this shrine altar. You can see like where George is getting the idea of like the idea of this great empire's falling, and which we eventually see the Bloodstone Emperor, who will also cast down the old gods and worship a black stone that fell to earth, with introducing new idols. And then you also, something that George doesn't go on, but something that I wish to talk about later when we talk about like when you think of real empires falling, you also take account not just the natural calamity and all the magic stuff that George is putting in. But when you put it in a real world sense, the corruption of man, of the courts, of the systems, of the guards, of the armies, everything. It's empires don't just fall in a day. It's a slow, long, grinding decline. And it's usually from many factors, logical, ecological, environmental, structural. A lot of things go into it. And that's something that like we're going to talk about tomorrow. Because it's something like when we talk about great empire, like when we know that it fell, but like what are the reasons besides just the magic reasons we're giving? Like let's just think about this in real world context. Like what leads to a fall of an empire? Because to blame it all on the Bloodstone Emperor solely as if he is the sole person to bring it, no, it takes a system to bring an empire down. When a Soviet starts burning books, you know it's due. Again, like these are things in my notes, but I just want to stop and pause and just show we're seeing a lot of it, and we're also seeing like a lot of like I already pointed out the River Eye sounds like a shy, and we see water lights are glowing under the waters of this river, and in a shy at night the waters glow with a green phosphorance, and at day the waters are black. These are all Lovecraftian ideas. It's like you can kind of see like what happens, what's gonna happen to Sarnath. Probably something similar, some similar catastrophe is probably what happened to Ashai. Gorgeous beyond thought was the feast of the 1,000th year of the destroying of Ebb. 1,000 years, they're still celebrating. Remember we kicked those Ib guys' asses? 1,000 years later, they're still celebrating it. For a decade, had it been talked off in the land of Nar, and as it drew nigh, there came to Sarnath on horses and camels and elephants, men from Thra, Illerneck, and Kadath, and all the cities of Nar and the lands beyond. Before the marble walls on the appointed night were pitched the pavilions of princes and the tents of travelers, and all the shore resounded with the song of happy revelers. Within his banquet hall reclined Nargis High, the king, drunken with ancient wine from the vaults of conquered Nath, and surrounded by feasting nobles and hurrying slaves. There were eaten many strange delicacies at that feast: peacocks from the isles of Nariel and the Middle Ocean, young goats from the distant hills of Implan, heels of camel from the Nausik desert, nuts and spices from Sidathrian groves, and pearls from wave-watched metal dissolved in the vinegar of Thra. Of sauces there was an untold number, prepared by the subtlest cooks of the Nar, and suited to the palate of every feaster. But most prized of all the viands were the great fishes from the lake, each of vast size and served up on golden platters set with rubies and diamonds. Now the fish in these shy are blind and twisted, and only fools and shadow binders will eat of their flesh. They could have been some real tasty fish back in the day. Whilst the king and his nobles feasted within the palace and viewed the crowning dishes that awaited them on golden platters, others feasted elsewhere. In the tower of the great temple, the priests held revels, and in pavilions without the walls, the princes of neighboring lands made merry. And it was the high priest, Naika, who first saw the shadows that descended from the gibbous moon into the lake, and the damnable green mists that arose from the lake to meet the moon, and to shroud in a sinister haze the towers and the domes of fated Sarnath. Thereafter, those in the towers and without the walls beheld strange lights on the water, and saw that the gray rock Acurian, which was wont to rear high above it near the shore, was almost submerged. And fear grew vaguely yet swiftly, so that the princes of Illerneck and Afar Rakal took down and folded their tents and pavilions and departed for the River Eye, though they scarce knew the reason for their departing. Then, close to the hour of midnight, all the bronze gates of Sarnath burst open and emptied forth a frenzied throng that blackened the plain, so that all the visiting princes and travelers fled away in fright. For on the faces of this throng was writ a madness born of horror unendurable, and on their tongues were words so terrible that no hearer paused for proof. Men whose eyes were wild with fear shrieked aloud of the sight within the king's banquet halls, where through the windows were seen no longer the forms of Nargis High and his nobles and slaves, but a horde of indescribable green voiceless things with bulging eyes, pouting flabby lips, and curious ears, things which danced horribly, bearing in their paws golden platters set with rubies and diamonds, containing uncouth flames. And the princes and travelers, as they fled from the doomed city of Sarnath on horses and camels and elephants, looked again upon the mist-begetting lake and saw the grey rock of Carcosa was quite submerged. Through all the land of Nar and the lands adjacent spread the tales of those who had fled from Sarnath, and caravans sought that accursed city and its precious metals no more. It was long ere any traveler went thither, and even then only the brave and adventurous young men of distant Felona dared make the journey. Adventurous young men of yellow hair and blue eyes, who are no kin to the men of Nar. These men indeed went to the lake to view Sarnath, but thought they found the vast still lake itself and the grey rock of Carcosa, which rears high above it near the shore. They behold not the wonder of the world and the pride of all mankind. Where once had risen walls of 300 cubits and towers yet higher, now stretched only the marshy shore, and where once had dwelt 50 millions of men, now crawled only the detestable green water lizard. Not even the mines of precious metal remained, for doom had come to Sarnath. But half buried in the rushes was spied a curious green idol of stone, an exceedingly ancient idol, coated with seaweed, and chiseled into the likeness of Bakrog, the great water lizard. That idol, enshrined in the high temple at Illerneck, was subsequently worshipped beneath the gibbous moon throughout the land of Nar. Thinking shy, thinking some cursed black stone. I'm thinking maybe a meteorite. I'm thinking it's probably in Stagai. Here we go. I mean, there's a lot that you can glean from this. There, like I said, there's the patrimony of Harkum, there's the there's the Great Empire itself, and then there's just a shy all by itself. There's so much from Sarnath that we can see that George has taken elements from. Changed a few things. We go from a sea green stone statue of a water lizard. Instead, we get an oily black stone that's more like a meteorite. But we do have these. Again, we do have these vestiges that are carved of it, of toads and the krakens and things like that. Oh, Ying too. That's Sithorios. Sithorios is another one that. Go Bug Dave. Bug Dave for Sithorios stream. That's a good one. That's another good one to cover. A lot that you could say about Sithorios. Okay, so we're going to move on. Our next story that we're going to read from Lovecraft, we're going to read Celephaïs. This is another one where some of these cities that we're going to talk about are mentioned, or at least have a form of them mentioned. The concept of the black stone, which is an extraterrestrial object, so Robert E. Howard invention. Oh, yeah. Lovecraft also, just like George, Lovecraft also borrowed a lot. There was that, it's basically like writers club where they kind of spitball ideas back and forth, and you have like earlier in the stream, if you missed, I talked about how Lovecraft became enamored with Robert W. Chambers, The King in Yellow, and borrowed a lot of elements from that. Yeah, there was like this. It's a whole big writers club that exchanged pen pals, that exchanged letters, and would incorporate elements and stuff from each other's stories. And occasionally you had somebody who's like hated another writer and would take something of theirs and write about it in like a really mocking, smarmy way. But for the most part, these guys were friends, and it was done with the best of respects, the best of intentions. Like mimicry is the best form of flattery. So it's like, I was like, oh, you took my thing. No, I borrowed your thing. And then some writers be like, yeah, you borrowed it and you kind of made it better. And then others will be like, hey, you made it work. I don't know. It varied. But yeah, the circle. Thank you. So Celephaïs. In a dream, Karan saw the city in the valley, and the sea coast beyond, and the snowy peak overlooking the sea, and the gaily painted galleys that sail out of the harbor toward the distant regions where the sea meets the sky. In a dream, it was also that he came by his name of Karains, for when he awake, he was called by another name. Perhaps it was natural for him to dream a new name, for he was the last of his family, and alone among the indifferent millions of London, so there were not many to speak to him and remind him who he had been. His money and lands were gone, and he did not care for the ways of people about him, but preferred to dream and write of his dreams. What he wrote was laughed at by those to whom he shewed it, and so that after a time he kept his writings to himself and finally ceased to write. The more he withdrew from the world about him, the more wonderful became his dreams, and it would not have been quite futile to try to describe them on paper. Karains was not modern, and did not think like others who wrote, whilst they strove to strip from life its embroidered robes of myth and to shew in naked ugliness the foul thing that is reality. Karains sought for beauty alone. When truth and experience failed to reveal it, he sought it in fancy and illusion, and found it on his very doorstep amid the nebulous memories of childhood tales and dreams. There are not many persons who know what wonders are open to them in the stories and visions of their youth, for when as children we listen and dream, we think but half-formed thoughts, and when as men we try to remember, we are dulled and prosaic with the poison of life. But some of us awake in the night with strange phantasms of enchanted hills and gardens, of fountains that sing in the sun, of golden cliffs overhanging murmuring seas, of plains that stretch down to sleeping cities of bronze and stone, and of shadowy companies of heroes that ride caparisoned white horses along the edges of thick forests. And then we know that we have looked back through the ivory gates into that world of wonder which was ours before we were wise and unhappy. Karains came very suddenly upon his old world of childhood. He had been dreaming of the house where he was born, the great stone house covered with ivy, where 13 generations of his ancestors had lived, and where he had hoped to die. It was moonlight, and he had stolen out into the fragrant summer night, through the gardens, down the terraces, past the great oaks of the park, and along the white road to the village. The village seemed very old, eaten away at the edge like the moon which had commenced to wane, and Karains wondered whether the peaked roofs of the small houses hid sleep or death. In the streets were spears of long grass, and the window panes on either side were either broken or filmily staring. Karains had not lingered, but had plodded on as though summoned towards some goal. He dared not disobey the summons for fear it might prove an illusion, like the urges and aspirations of waking life, which do not lead to any goal. Then he had been drawn down a lane that led off from the village street toward the Channel Cliffs, and had come to the end of things, to the precipice and the abyss where all the village and all the world fell abruptly into the unechoing emptiness of infinity, and where even the sky ahead was empty and unlit by the crumbling moon and the peering stars. Faith had urged him on, over the precipice and into the gulf, where he had floated down, 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 past dark, shapeless, undreamed dreams, faintly glowing spheres that may have been partly dreams, and laughing winged things that seemed to mock the dreamers of all the worlds. Then a rift seemed to open in the darkness before him, and he saw the city of the valley, glistening radiantly far, far below, with a background of sea and sky and a snow-capped mountain near the shore. Karains had awaked the very moment he beheld the city, yet he knew from his brief glance that was none other than Celephaïs, and the valley of Uth-Nargai, beyond the Tanarian hills, where his spirit had dwelt all the eternity of an hour one summer afternoon very long ago, when he had slipped away from his nurse and let the warm sea breeze lull him to sleep as he watched the clouds from the cliff near the village. He had protested then, when they had found him, waked him, and carried him home, for just as he was aroused, he had been about to sail into a golden galley for those alluring regions where the sea meets the sky. And now he was equally resentful of awaking, for he had found his fabulous city after 40 weary years. But 3 nights afterwards, Karains came again to Celephaïs. As before, he dreamed first of the village that was asleep or dead, and of the abyss down which one must float silently. Then the rift appeared again, and he beheld the glittering minarets of the city, and saw the graceful galleys riding at anchor in the blue harbor, and watched the ginkgo trees of Mount Erin swaying in the sea breeze. But this time he was not snatched away, and like a winged being settled gradually over a grassy hillside, till finally his feet rested gently on the turf. He had indeed come back to the valley of Uth-Nargai and the splendid city of Celephaïs. Down the hill amid scented grasses and brilliant flowers walked Kiranes, over the bubbling Naraxa on the small wooden bridge where he had carved his name so many years ago, and through the whispering grove to the great stone bridge by the city gate. All was as of old, nor were the marble walls discolored, nor the polished bronze statue upon them tarnished. And Kiranes saw that he need not tremble lest the things he knew be vanished, for even the sentries on the ramparts were the same, and still as young as he remembered them. When he entered the city, past the bronze gates, and over the onyx pavements, the merchants and camel drivers greeted him, as if he had never been away. And it was the same at the turquoise temple of Nath-Horthoth, where the orchid-wreathed priest told him there is no time in Uth-Nargai, but only perpetual youth. Then Kiranes walked through the street of pillars to the seaward wall, where gathered the traders and sailors and strange men from the regions where the sea meets the sky. There he stayed long, gazing out over the bright harbor, where the ripples sparkled beneath an unknown sun, where rode lightly the galleys from far places over the water. And he gazed also upon Mount Erin, rising regally from the shore, its lower slopes green with swaying trees, and its white summit touching the sky. More than ever, Kiranes wished to sail in a galley to the far places of which he had heard so many strange tales, and he sought again the captain who had agreed to carry him so long ago. He found the man, a Thib, sitting on the same chest of spices he had sat upon before, and a Thib seemed not to realize that any time had passed. Then the two rowed to a galley in the harbor, and giving orders to the oarsmen, commenced to sail out into the billowy Serenarian Sea that leads to the sky. For several days they glided undulatingly over the water, till finally they came to the horizon, where the sea meets the sky. Here the galley paused not at all, but floated easily in the blue sky among fleecy clouds tinted with rose. And far beneath the heel, Kiranes could see strange lands and rivers and cities of surpassing beauty, spread indolently in the sunshine, which seemed never to lessen or disappear. At length the Thib told him that their journey was near its end, and that they would soon enter the harbor of Serenian, the pink marble city of the clouds, which is built on that ethereal coast where the west wind flows into the sky. But as the highest of the city's carven towers came into sight, there was a sound somewhere in space, and Kiranes awaked in his London garret. For many months after that, Kiranes sought the marvelous city of Celephaïs and its skybound galleys in vain, and though his dreams carried him to many gorgeous and unheard-of places, no one whom he met could tell him how to find Uth-Nargai beyond the Tarnarian hills. One night he went flying over dark mountains, where there were faint lone campfires at great distances apart, and strange shaggy herds with tinkling bells on the leaders. And in the wildest part of this hill country, so remote that few men had ever seen it, he found a hideously ancient wall or causeway of stone, zigzagging along the ridges and valleys. Too gigantic ever to have risen by human hands, and of such length that neither end of it could be seen. Wall, 5 forts, what's across the sunset sea, what's past the 5 forts. We can glean we can take these ideas that Lovecraft's doing and envision again, what is George doing with this far, far east and the unending sunset sea? What stands at the end of the grim forest of Mosavie? Is it where the world ends? Does the ocean eventually reach? Are there America continents that sit in between? Or would you eventually reach Essos by sailing west from Westeros? So Lovecraft's doing the same thing. And these are the things that I want, that I'm really into when it comes to George's writings, and when it comes to Lovecraft, and same deal with Lovecraft. One night he went flying over dark mountains where there were faint lone campfires, great distances apart, and strange shaggy herds with tinkling... Oh, I read all of this. Beyond that wall in the gray dawn, he came to a land of quaint gardens and cherry trees, and when the sun rose, he beheld such beauty of red and white flowers, green foliage and lawns, white paths, diamond brooks, blue lakelets, carven bridges, and red-roofed pagodas, that he for a moment forgot Celephaïs in sheer delight. But he remembered it again when he walked down a white path toward a red-roofed pagoda, and would have questioned the people of that land about it had he not found that there were no people there, but only birds and bees and butterflies. On another night, Kiranes walked up a damp stone spiral stairway endlessly, and came to a tower window overlooking a mighty plain and river lit by the full moon. And in the silent city that spread away from the riverbank, he thought he beheld some feature or arrangement which he had known before. He would have descended and asked the way to Uth-Nargai, had not a fearsome aurora sputtered up from some remote place beyond the horizon, shewing the ruined antiquity of the city, and the stagnation of the reedy river, and the death lying upon that land as it had been since King Caenartholis came home from his conquest to find the vengeance of the gods. So Kiranes sought fruitlessly for the marvelous city of Celephaïs and its galleys that sailed to Saranarian and the sky, meanwhile seeing many wonders, and once barely escaping from the high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face and dwells all alone in a prehistoric stone monastery on the cold desert plateau of Leng. The king in yellow is in Leng. In time, he grew so impatient of the bleak intervals of the day that he began buying drugs in order to increase his periods of sleep. Hashish helped a great deal, and once set him to a part of space where form does not exist, but where glowing gases study the secret of existence. Oh, you and me too, buddy. I take indica occasionally to sleep. And a violet-colored gas told him that this part of space was outside what he had called infinity. The gas had not heard of planets and organisms before, but identified Kiranes merely as one from the infinity where matter, energy, and gravitation exist. Kiranes was now very anxious to return to minaret-studied Celephaïs and increase his doses of drugs, but eventually he had no more money left and could buy no drugs. He spent his whole wad. Then one summer day he was turned out of his garret and wandered aimlessly through the streets, drifting over a bridge to a place where the houses grew thinner and thinner. And it was there that fulfillment came, and he met the cortege of knights come from Celephaïs to bear him thither forever. Handsome knights they were, astride roan horses and clad in shining armor, with tabards of cloth of gold curiously emblazoned. So numerous were they that Kiranes almost mistook them for an army, but their leader told him they were sent in his honor, since it was he who had created Uth-Nargai in his dreams, on which account he was now to be appointed its chief god forevermore. Then they gave Kiranes a horse and placed him at the head of the cavalcade, and all rode majestically through the downs of Surrey and onward toward the region where Kiranes and his ancestors were born. It was very strange, but as the riders read on, they seemed to gallop back through time, for whenever they passed through a village in the twilight, they saw only such houses and villagers as Chaucer or men before him might have seen, and sometimes they saw knights on horseback with small companies of retainers. When it grew dark, they traveled more swiftly, so soon they were flying uncannily as if in the air. In the dim dawn, they came upon the village which Kiranes had seen alive in his childhood, and asleep or dead in his dreams. It was alive now, and early villagers curtsied at the horsemen clattered down the street and turned off into the lane that ends in the abyss of dream. Kiranes had entered that abyss only at night and wondered what it would look like by day, so he watched anxiously as the column approached its brink. Just as they galloped up the rising ground to the precipice of a golden glare, came somewhere out of the east and hid all the landscape in its effulgent draperies. The abyss was now a seething chaos of roseate and cerulean splendor, and invisible voices sang exultantly as the nightly entourage plunged over the edge and floated gracefully down past glittering clouds and silvery coruscations. Endlessly down the horsemen floated, their chargers pawing the ether as if galloping over golden sands. And then the luminous vapor spread apart to reveal a greater brightness, the brightness of the city of Celephaïs, and the sea coast beyond, and the snowy peak overlooking the sea, and the gaily painted galleys that sail out of the harbor toward distant regions where the sea meets the sky. And Kiranes reigned thereafter over Uthnorgai and all the neighboring regions of Dream, and held his court alternately in Celephaïs and in the cloud-fashioned Serenian. He reigns there still, and will reign happily forever, though below the cliffs at Innsmouth, the channel tides played mockingly with the body of a tramp who had stumbled through the half-deserted village at dawn, played mockingly and casted it upon the rocks by ivy-colored Trevor Towers, where a notably fat and especially offensive millionaire brewer enjoys the purchase atmosphere of extinct nobility. So it kind of sounds like Kiranes has been drinking a lot of Shade of the Evening. And some unscrupulous Shade of the Evening brewer making a pretty penny off of him. All right, we're going to go next to the other gods. Which one? Atop the tallest of Earth's peaks dwell the gods of Earth, and suffer no man to tell that he hath looked upon them. Lesser peaks they once inhabited, but ever the men from the plains would scale the slopes of rock and snow, driving the gods to higher and higher mountains, till now only the last remains. When they left their older peaks, they took with them all signs of themselves, save once, it is said, when they left a carven image on the face of the mountain, which they called Ingrenek. But now they have betaken themselves to unknown Kadath, in the cold waste where no man treads, and are grown stern, having no higher peak where to flee at the coming of men. They are grown stern, and where once they suffered men to displace them, they now forbid men to come, or coming, to depart. It is well for men that they know not of Kadath in the cold waste, else they would seek unjudiciously to scale it. And yeah, and George Kadath, his Kadath, sits right immediately east of the Five Forts, and seemingly it sits on a plain, and it basically seems like it's the only city marked in the Grey Waste. And here, unknown Kadath sits in the cold waste here. Sometimes when Earth's gods are homesick, they visit in the still night the peaks where once they dwelt, and weep softly as they try to play in the olden ways on remembered slopes. Men have felt the tears of the gods on white-capped Terai, though they have thought it rain, and have heard the sighs of the gods in the plain of dawn winds of Larian. In cloud ships, the gods are wont to travel, and wise cotters have legends that keep them from certain high peaks at night when it is cloudy. For the gods are not lenient as of old. In Ulthar, which lies beyond the river sky, once dwelt an old man avid to behold the gods of earth, a man deeply learned in the 7 cryptical books of San, and familiar with the Gnostic manuscripts of distant and frozen Lamar. His name was Barzai the Wise, and the villagers tell of how he went up a mountain on the night of the strange eclipse. Barzai knew so much of the gods that he could tell of their comings and goings, and guessed so many of their secrets that he was deemed half a god himself. It was he who wisely advised the burgesses of Ulthar when they passed their remarkable law against the slaying of cats, and who first told the young priest to tell where it is that black cats go at midnight on St. John's Eve. Barzai was learned in the lore of Earth's gods, and had gained a desire to look upon their faces. He believed that his great secret knowledge of gods could shield him from their wrath, so resolved to go up to the summit of high and rocky Hothed Clog on a night where he knew the gods would be there. You're playing with fire, buddy. You're playing with fire. Hartheg Claw is far in the stony desert beyond Hatheg, for which it is named, and rises like a rock statue in a silent temple. Around its peak the mists play, always mournfully, for mists are the memories of the gods, and the gods loved Hartheg Claw when they dwelt upon it in the old days. Often the gods of earth visit Hothig in their ships of cloud, casting pale vapors over the slopes as they dance reminiscently on the summit under a clear moon. The villagers of Hothig say it is ill to climb Hothig at any time, and deadly to climb it by night when pale vapors hide the summit and the moon. But Barzai heeded them not when he came from neighboring Uthar with the young priest Atal, who was his disciple. Atal was the only son of an innkeeper and was sometimes afraid, but Barzai's father had been a landgrave who dwelt in an ancient castle, so he had no common superstition in his blood and only laughed at the fearful cotters. Barzai and Atal went out of Hothig into the stony desert despite the prayers of peasants, and talked of Earth's gods by their campfires at night. Many days they traveled, and from afar saw lofty Hothig with its aureole of mournful mist. On the 13th day they reached the mountain's lonely base, and Atal spoke of his fears, but Barzai was old and learned, and had no fears, so led the way boldly up the slope that no man had scaled since the time of Sansu, who was written of with fright in the moldy Akkadic manuscripts. The way was rocky and made perilous by chasms, cliffs, and falling stones. Later it grew cold and snowy, and Barzai and Atal often slipped and fell as they hewed and plodded upward with staves and axes. Finally the air grew thin, and the sky changed color, and the climbers found it hard to breathe, but still they toiled up and up, marveling at the strangeness of the scene and the thrilling at the thought of what would happen on the summit when the moon was out and the pale vapor spread around. For 3 days they climbed higher, higher, and higher toward the roof of the world, when they camped to wait for the clouding of the moon. Black cats don't follow the seven. No, black cats haunt the Red Keep. I'm of the opinion that big scarred tomcat is Balerion, is little Princess Rhaenys black cat that she had before the terrible sacking of King's Landing. I would say black cats probably follow the old gods, if anything, or they follow R'hllor. For 4 nights no clouds came, and the moon shone down through the thin, mournful mists around the silent pinnacle. Excuse me. Sorry. Water break. My black cat's over on the blanket right now, sleeping. Damn it. He's all curled up. I'll let him go. For 4 nights no clouds came, and the moon shone down cold through thin, mournful mists around the silent pinnacle. Then on the 5th night, which was the night of the full moon, Barzai saw some dense clouds far to the north, and stayed up with Atal to watch them draw near. Thick and majestic they sailed slowly and deliberately onward, ranging themselves round the peak high above the watchers, and hiding the moon and the summit from view. For a long hour the watchers gazed, while the vapor swirled and the screen of clouds grew thicker and more restless. Barzai was wise in the lore of Earth's gods, and listened hard for certain sounds, but Atal felt the chill of the vapors and the awe of the night, and feared much. And when Barzai began to climb higher and beckon eagerly, it was long before Atal would follow. So thick were the vapors that the way was hard, and though Atal followed on at last, he could scarce see the gray shape of Barzai on the dim slope above in the clouded moonlight. Barzai forged very far ahead, and seemed, despite his age, to climb more easily than Atal, fearing not the steepness that began to grow too great for any save a strong and dauntless man, nor pausing at wide black chasms that Atal scarce could leap. And so they went up wildly over rocks and gulfs, slipping and stumbling, and sometimes awed at the vastness and horrible silence of bleak ice pinnacles and mute granite steeps. Very suddenly Barzai went out of Atal's sight, scaling a hideous cliff that seemed to bulge outward and block the path for any climber not inspired of Earth's gods. Atal was far below, and planning what he should do when he reached the place, when curiously he noticed that the light had grown strong, as if the cloudless peak and moonless meeting place of the gods were very near. And as he scrambled on toward the bulging cliff and leaden sky, he felt fears more shocking than any he had known before. Then through the high mist he heard the voice of unseen Barzai shouting wildly in delight. I have heard the gods. I have heard Earth's gods singing in reveille on Hothig Claw. The voices of Earth's gods are known to Barzai the prophet. The mists are thin and the moon is bright, and I shall see the gods dancing wildly on Hothig Claw that they loved in youth. The wisdom of Barzai hath made him greater than Earth's gods, and against his will their spells and barriers are as naught. Barzai will behold the gods, the proud gods, the secret gods, the gods of Earth who spurn the sight of men. Atal could not hear the voices Barzai heard, but he was now close to the bulging cliff and scanning it for footholds. Then he heard Barzai's voice grow shriller and louder. The mists are very thin, and the moon casts shadows on the slope. The voices of Earth's gods are high and wild, and they fear the coming of Barzai the Wise, who is greater than they. The moon's light flickers as Earth's gods dance against it. I shall see the dancing forms of the gods that leap and howl in the moonlight. The light is dimmer and the gods are afraid. I know, oh, oh, oh. Whilst Barzai was shouting these things, Atal felt a spectral change in the air, as if the laws of Earth were bowing to greater laws. For though the way was steeper than ever, the upward path was now grown fearsomely easy, and the bulging cliff proved scarce an obstacle when he reached it, and slid perilously up its convex face. The light of the moon had strangely failed, and as Atal plunged upward through the mist, he heard Barzai the Wise shrieking in the shadows. The moon is dark, and the gods dance in the night. There is terror in the sky, for upon the moon hath sunk an eclipse foretold in no books of men or of Earth's gods. There is unknown magic on Hothig Claw, for the screams of the frightened gods have turned to laughter, and the slopes of ice shoot up endlessly into the black heavens whither I am plunging. High, high, at last, in the dim light, I behold the gods of Earth. For the night is long and full of terrors. And now Atal, slipping dizzily up over inconceivable steeps, heard in the dark a loathsome laughing, mixed with such a cry as no man else ever save in the Phlegian unrelatable nightmares, a cry wherein reverberated the horror and anguish of a haunted lifetime packed into one atrocious moment. The other gods, the other gods, the gods of the outer hells that guard the feeble gods of Earth. Look away, go back, do not see. Do not see the vengeance of the infinite abysses that curse that damnable pit. Merciful gods of Earth, I am falling into the sky. And as Atal shut his eyes and stopped his ears and tried to jump downward against the frightful pull from unknown heights, there resounded on Hothig Claw that terrible peal of thunder, which awaked the good cotters of the plains and the honest burgesses of Hothig and Nir and Ulthar, and caused them to behold through the clouds that strange eclipse of the moon that no book ever predicted. And when the moon came out at last, Atal was safe on the lower snows of the mountains, without sight of Earth's gods or of the other gods. Now it is told in the moldy, Nakadic manuscripts that Sansu found naught but wordless ice and rock when he climbed Hothig Claw in the youth of the world. Yet when the men of Ulthar and Nir and Hothig crushed their fears and scaled that haunted steep by day in search of Barzai the Wise, they found graven in the naked stone of the summit a curious and cyclopean symbol 50 cubits wide, as if the rock had been riven by some titanic chisel. And the symbol was like to one that learned men have discerned in those frightful parts of the Nodic manuscripts, which are too ancient to be read. This they found. Barzai the Wise they never found, nor could the holy priest Atal ever be persuaded to pray for his soul's repose. Moreover, to this day, the people of Ulthar and Nir and Hotheg fear eclipses and pray by night when pale vapors hide the mountain's top and moon. And above the mists on Hothig Claw, Earth's gods sometimes dance reminiscently, for they know they are safe, and love to come down from unknown Kadath in ships of cloud and play in the olden way, as they did when Earth was new, and men not given to the climbing of inaccessible places. There's a lot we could unpack from that one. But But we're going to move on because we are 2 hours and 45 minutes in, and there were 2 other stories I wanted to read. So we're going to go with the Hound, and then we're going to wrap up with Dagon, which is always a good favorite when especially when we're talking Ironborn and Euron a bit tomorrow. But so first we're going to do the Hound. All right. In my tortured ears, there sounds unceasingly a nightmare whirring and flapping, and a faint, distant baying as of some gigantic hound. It is not dream. It is not, I fear, even madness, for too much has already happened to me to give me these merciful doubts. St. John is a mangled corpse. I alone know why, and such is my knowledge that I am about to blow out my brains, for fear I shall be mangled in the same way. Down unlit and illimitable corridors of eldritch fantasy sweep the black, shapeless nemesis that drives me to self-annihilation. May heaven forgive the folly and morbidity which led us both to so monstrous a fate. Wearied with the commonplace of prosaic world, where even the joys of romance and adventure soon grow stale, St. John and I had followed enthusiastically every aesthetic and intellectual movement which promised respite from our devastating ennui. The enigmas of the symbolists and the ecstasies of the pre-Raphaelites were ours in their time, but each new mood was drained too soon of its diverting novelty and appeal. Only the somber philosophy of the decadence could hold us, and this we found potent only by increasing gradually the depth and diabolism of our penetrations. Baudelaire and Huysmans were soon exhausted of thrills, till finally there remained for us only the more direct stimuli of unnatural personal experiences and adventures. It was this frightful emotional need which led us eventually to that detestable course, which even in my present fear I mentioned with shame and timidity, that hideous extremity of human outrage, the abhorred practice of grave robbing. Grave robbing we will go. I cannot reveal the details of our shocking expeditions, or catalog even partly the worst of the trophies adorning the nameless museum we prepared in the great stone house where we jointly dwelt alone and servantless. Our museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place where, with the satanic tastes of neurotic virtuosity, we had assembled a universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. It was a secret room, far, far underground, where huge winged demons carven of basalt and onyx vomited from wide grinning mouths, weird green and orange light, and hidden pneumatic pipes ruffled into kaleidoscopic dances of death, the lines of red charnel things, hand in hand woven into voluminous black handings. Through these pipes came at will the odors our moods most craved, sometimes the scent of pale funeral lilies, sometimes the narcotic incense of imagined Eastern shrines of the kingly dead, and sometimes, how I shudder to recall it, the frightful soul-upheaving stenches of the uncovered grave. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies, alternating with comely, lifelike bodies, perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist's art, and with headstones snatched from the oldest churchyards of the world. Niches here and there contained skulls of all shapes, and heads preserved in various stages of dissolution. There one might find the rotting bald pates of famous noblemen and the fresh and radiantly golden heads of new buried children. Statues and paintings there were all, of fiendish subjects, and some executed by St. John and myself. A locked portfolio, bound in tanned human skin, held certain unknown and unnameable drawings which it was rumored Goya had perpetrated but dared not acknowledge. There were nauseous musical instruments, stringed, brass, and woodwind, on which St. John and I sometimes produced dissonances of exquisite morbidity and cacodemonical ghastliness. Man, that's a word. While in a multitude of inlaid ebony cabinets reposed by the most incredible and unimaginable variety of tomb loot ever assembled by human madness and perversity. It is of this loot in particular that I must not speak, Thank God I had the courage to destroy it long before I thought of destroying myself. The predatory excursions on which we collected our unmentionable treasures were always artistically memorable events. We were no vulgar ghouls, but worked only under certain conditions of mood, landscape, environment, weather, season, and moonlight. These pastimes were to us the most exquisite form of aesthetic expression, and we gave their details a fastidious technical care. An inappropriate hour, a jarring lighting effect, or a clumsy manipulation of the damp sod would almost totally destroy for us that ecstatic titillation which followed the exhumation of some ominous grinning secret of the earth. Our quest for noble scenes and piquant conditions was feverish and insatiate. St. John was always the leader, and he it was who led the way at last to that mocking, that accursed spot which brought us our hideous and inevitable doom. But what malign fatality were we lured to that terrible hall and churchyard? I think it was the dark rumor and legendary, the tale of one buried for 5 centuries, who had himself been a ghoul in his time and had stolen a potent thing from a mighty sepulchre. I can recall the scene in these final moments, the pale autumnal moon over the graves, casting long, horrible shadows, the grotesque trees drooping sullenly to meet the neglected grass, and the crumbling slabs, the vast legions of strangely colossal bats that flew against the moon. The antique giving church pointed a huge spectral finger at the livid sky. The phosphorescent insects that danced like death fires under the yews in a distant corner, the odors of mold vegetation, and less explicable things that mingled feebly with the night wind from over far swamps and seas. And worst of all, the faint, deep-toned baying of some gigantic hound, which we could neither see nor definitely place. As we heard the suggestion of baying, we shuddered, remembering the tales of the peasantry, for he whom we sought had centuries before been found in the self-same spot, torn and mangled by the claws and teeth of some unspeakable beast. Know what they don't say about leather light shades? They smell funny. D, I will skin you alive and put you in a box. A glass box. Which I will display on my mantle. That's just making me think of It's Always Sunny. Like, you have skin luggage? No, the smell. You haven't thought of the smell, you bitch. Get a good It's Always Sunny reference in on this. I remember how we delved into the school's grave with our spades, and how we thrilled at the picture of ourselves, the grave, the pale watching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church, the dancing death fires, the sickening odors, the gently moaning night wind, and the strange, half-heard, directionless baying of whose objective existence we could scarcely be sure. Then we struck a substance harder than the damp mold and beheld a rotting oblong box crusted with mineral deposits from the long undisturbed ground. It was incredibly tough and thick, but so old that we finally pried it open and feasted our eyes on what it held. Much, amazingly much, was left of the object despite the lapse of 500 years. The skeleton, though crushed in places by the jaws of the thing that had killed it, held together with surprising firmness, and we gloated over the clean white skull and its long firm teeth and its eyeless sockets that once had glowed with a charnel fever like our own. In the coffin lay an amulet of curious and exotic design, which had apparently been worn around the sleeper's neck. It was the oddly conventionalized figure of a crouching winged hound, or sphinx, with a semi-canine face, and was exquisitely carved in antique oriental fashion from a small piece of green jade. The expression on its features was repellent in the extreme, savoring at once of death, bestiality, and malevolence. Around the base was an inscription in characters which neither St. John nor I could identify, and on the bottom, like a maker's seal, was graven a grotesque and formidable skull. Immediately upon beholding this amulet, we knew that we must possess it, that this treasure alone was our logical pelf from the centuried grave. Even had its outlines been unfamiliar, we would have desired it, but as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar. Alien it indeed was to all art and literature, which sane and balanced readers know, but we recognized it as the thing hinted in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazrid, the ghastly soul symbol of the corpse-eating cult of inaccessible Leng in Central Asia. All too well did we trace the sinner lineaments described by the old Arab demonologist. Lineaments, he wrote, drawn from some obscure supernatural manifestation of the souls of those who vexed and gnawed at the dead. Okay, so here, Leng, we have Leng in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's an island south of Yi, and it's said that the old ones dwell there. Here in Lovecraft, Leng changes depending on where. In some cases, it's a plateau in Antarctica, like in the Mountains of Madness. Here, it's in Central Asia, and it has a ghastly soul. It's populated by a corpse-eating cult. If we look at George R. R. Martin, if we go past the Five Forts, we have the Cannibal Sands, which lay nestled around. There's two of them that lay opposite sides of the Grey Waste, and those are said to be inhabited by groups of people, by cannibalistic people who feed on human flesh. So it's like, so we're taking one thing that appears in these Lovecraft tales, changing it to another, but still keeping a central idea and employing that to another place with the Cannibal Sands, which again runs out of the Grey Waste, which comes immediately out from Kadath. Seizing the green jade object, we gave a last glance at the bleached and cavern-eyed face of its owner and closed up the grave as we found it. As we hastened from that abhorrent spot, the stolen amulet in St. John's pocket, we thought we saw the bats descend in a body to the earth we had so lately rifled, as if seeking for some cursed and unholy nourishment. But the autumn moon shone weak and pale, and we could not be sure. So, too, as we sailed the next day away from Holland to our home, we thought we heard the faint, distant baying of some gigantic hound in the background, but the autumn wind moaned sad and wan, and we could not be sure. Less than a week after our return to England, strange things began to happen. We lived as recluses, devoid of friends, alone, and without servants, in a few rooms of an ancient manor house on a bleak and unfrequented moor, so that our doors were seldom disturbed by the knock of the visitor. Now, however, we were troubled by what seemed to be frequent fumblings in the night, not only around the doors, but around the windows also, upper as well as lower. Once we fancied that a large, opaque body darkened the library window when the moon was shining against it, and another time we thought we heard a whirring or flapping sound not far off. On each occasion, investigation revealed nothing, and we began to ascribe the occurrences to imagination alone. That same curiously disturbed imagination which still prolonged in our ears the faint, far baying we thought we had heard in the Holland churchyard. The jade amulet now reposed in a niche in our museum, and sometimes we burned strangely scented candles before it. We read much in Hazard's Necronomicon about its properties, and about the relation of ghoul souls to the objects it symbolized, and were disturbed by what we read. Then terror came. On the night of September 24th, 19, year redacted, I heard a knock at my chamber door. There came a knock at my chamber door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Fancying in St. John's, I bade the knocker enter, but was answered only by a shrill laugh. There was no one in the corridor. When I aroused St. John from his sleep, he professed entire ignorance of the event and became as worried as I. It was that night that the faint, distant being over the moor became to us a certain and dreaded reality. 4 days later, whilst we were both in the hidden museum, there came a low, cautious scratching at the single door which led to the secret library staircase. Our alarm was now divided, for besides our fear of the unknown, we had always entertained a dread that our grisly collection might be discovered. Extinguishing all lights, we proceeded to the door and threw it suddenly open, whereupon we felt an uncountable rush of air, and heard, as if receding far away, a queer combination of rustling, tittering, and articulate chatter. Whether we were mad, dreaming, or in our senses, we did not try to determine. We only realized with the blackest of apprehensions that the apparently disembodied chatter was beyond a doubt in the Dutch language. Hinger, dinger, dinger. After that, we lived in growing terror, growing horror and fascination. Mostly we held to the theory that we were jointly going mad from our life of unnatural excitements, but sometimes it pleased us more to dramatize ourselves as the victims of some creeping and appalling doom. Bizarre manifestations were now too frequent to count. Our lonely house was seemingly alive with the presence of some malign being whose nature we could not guess, and every night that demonic baying rolled over the windswept moor, always louder and louder. On October 29th, we found in the soft earth underneath the library window a series of footprints, utterly impossible to describe. They were as baffling as the hordes of great bats which haunted the old manor house in unprecedented and increasing numbers. The horror reached a culmination on November 18th, when St. John, walking home after dark from the distant railway station, was seized by some frightful carnivorous thing and torn to ribbons. His screams had reached the house, and I had hastened to the terrible scene in time to hear a whir of wings and see a vague, black, cloudy thing silhouetted against the rising moon. My friend was dying when I spoke to him, and he could not answer coherently. All he could do was to whisper, "The amulet. That damned thing." Then he collapsed, an inert mass of mangled flesh. I buried him the next midnight in one of our neglected gardens and mumbled over his body one of the devilish rituals he had loved in life. And as I pronounced the last demonic sentence, I heard afar on the moor the faint baying of some gigantic hound. The moon was up, but I dared not look at it. And when I saw on the dim-lit moor a wide nebulous shadow sweeping from mound to mound, I shut my eyes and threw myself down upon the ground. When I arose trembling, I know not how much later, I staggered into the house and made shocking obeisances before the enshrined amulet of green jade. Being now afraid to live alone in the ancient house on the moor, I departed on the following day for London, taking with me the amulet after destroying by fire and burial the rest of the impious collection in the museum. But after 3 nights I heard the baying again, and before a week was over, felt strange eyes upon me whenever it was dark. One evening, as I strolled on a Victoria embankment for some needed air, I saw a black shape obscure one of the reflections of the lamps in the water. A wind stronger than the night wind rushed by, and I knew that what had befallen St. John must soon befall me. The next day, I carefully wrapped the green jade amulet and sailed for Holland. What mercy I might gain by returning the thing to its silent, sleeping owner, I knew not, but I felt that I must at least try any steps conceivably logical. What the hound was, and why it pursued me, were questions still vague, but I had first heard the baying in the ancient churchyard, and every subsequent event, including St. John's dying whisper, had served to connect the curse with the stealing of the amulet. Accordingly, I sank into the nethermost abysses of despair when, at an inn in Rotterdam, I discovered that thieves had despoiled me of this sole means of salvation. The baying was loud that evening, and in the morning I read of a nameless deed in the vilest quarter of the city. The rabble were in terror, for upon an evil tenement had fallen a red death beyond the foulest previous crime of the neighborhood. In a squalid thieves' den, an entire family had been torn to shreds by an unknown thing which left no trace, and those around had heard all night above the unusual clamor of drunken voices a faint, deep, insistent note as of that of a gigantic hound. So at last I stood again in that unwholesome churchyard, where a pale winter moon cast hideous shadows, and leafless trees drooped sullenly to meet the withered frosty grass and cracking slabs, and the ivied church pointed a jeering finger at the unfriendly sky, and the night wind howled maniacally from over frozen swamps and frigid seas. The baying was very faint now, and it ceased altogether as I approached the ancient grave I had once violated, and frightening away an abnormally large horde of bats which had been hovering curiously around it. I know not why I went thither less to pray or gibber out insane pleas and apologies to the calm white thing that lay within. But whatever my reason, I attacked the half-frozen sod with a desperation partly mine and partly that of a dominating will outside myself. Excavation was much easier than I expected, though at one point I encountered a queer interruption when a lean vulture darted down out of the cold sky and pecked frantically at the grave earth until I killed him with a blow of my spade. Finally, I reached the rotting oblong box and removed the damp nitrous cover. This is the last rational act I ever performed. For crouching within that centuried coffin, embraced by a close-packed nightmare retinue of huge, sinewy sleeping bats, was the bony thing my friend and I had robbed, not clean and placid as we had seen it then, but covered with caked blood and shreds of alien flesh and hair, and leering sentiently at me with phosphorescent sockets and sharp insanguine fangs, yawning twisted in mockery of my inevitable doom. And when it gave from those grinning jaws a deep sardonic bay as of some gigantic hound, and I saw that it held in its gory, filthy claw the lost and fateful amulet of green jade, I merely screamed and ran away idiotically, my scream soon devolving into peals of hysterical laughter. Madness writhed the star wind, its claws and teeth sharpened on centuries of corpses, dripping death astride a bacchanal of bats from night-black ruins of buried temples of Belial. Now, as the baying of that dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy whirring and flapping of those accursed webbed wings circles closer and closer, I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion which is my only refuge from the unnamed and unnameable. And we will end tonight with Dagon. For I am an admirer of that esteemed amphibiologist, the nimble Dr. Richard Crabb. This is for you, Nimble Dick. Dagon. Or Dagon. Dagon it. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It is in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast upon the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. for there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and homogeneity of the landscape expressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from the sky, which seemed to be almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had laid hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might, nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight and evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from the distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy indeed. I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Though my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young. I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose massive bulk had known the workmanship, perhaps the worship, of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight and in both directions. And almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on account of their enormous size were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Dor. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were strewn disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage to some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips. Damon. Okay, so back. We're getting a lot. We're getting a lot of, squisher. It's squishers. These are portraits of squishers. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to a certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent to the sloping cliff and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm sometime after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know not that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. but soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever, as I lay sun-stricken and raven in the open boat after my escape from the German man of war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless thing that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand, the window, the window. And that is where we will end it for tonight. So thank you for joining me and Damon down in the den of the Great Waste. Join us tomorrow night. I will be on with David Lightbringer for Starry Night Wisdom. We will be talking the further east, the 5 forts, the legendary cities of Carcosa and Kadath, and a lot of these Lovecraftian things. So yes, thank you very much. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Again, I'm doing this for fun, but if you enjoy this, since a lot of these stories are in the public domain, we can have more reading nights, and maybe we'll make this a regular thing. All right, so good night. I'll see you all tomorrow.